Yo, what's up everyone? It's No Harry, and today we're checking out, what if Harry collapsed in Great Hall and emergency scan revealed 40 illegal bindings draining his core. Drop a like if you're hyped. Subscribe for daily content. Let's get this story started. Chapter 1, The Diagnostic. The eggs were wrong. Harry couldn't have explained why that was the thing that finally broke through the grey fog he'd been living inside for weeks, but there it was, scrambled eggs, slightly overcooked, sitting on the plate in front of him like an accusation. He'd asked for them the same way every morning for 5 years. Soft, with pepper. Every morning, the house elves got it right. This morning he was staring at something rubbery and pale and he couldn't summon a single feeling about it. Not irritation. Not disappointment. Nothing. He pushed the plate aside. "You're not eating again," Hermione said, without looking up from magical theory and its practical applications, which she was reading while simultaneously buttering toast, a skill that Harry suspected was less multitasking and more that she simply did not need to pay attention to anything that wasn't made of words. "I'm fine. You said that yesterday." It was also true yesterday. Ron dropped down across from them, loaded his own plate with approximately everything within arm's reach, and looked at Harry with the kind of direct assessment that Ron disguised as casualness and nobody was ever fooled by. "You look like something the cat dragged in and then thought better of." "Thanks. Welcome." Ron stabbed a sausage. "Did you sleep?" Harry considered lying. The lie was already in his mouth. Yeah, fine, a bit restless, and it would have worked, it always worked. Ron and Hermione had been accepting versions of that lie for 5 years. But this morning, for some reason, the lie felt heavier than usual. Like he was carrying it on top of everything else he was already carrying and the weight had crossed some invisible threshold in the night. "Not really," he said instead. Hermione looked up from her book. "Harry, it's fine," he said, which was a different kind of lie, and they both knew it, and the morning kept moving around them the way it always did, the great hall filling with noise and motion and the smell of food, owls streaming through the enchanted ceiling in ribbons of feather and wing, the Slytherin table already loud with something Draco Malfoy was holding court about, the staff table quiet and dignified at the front of the room where Dumbledore wasn't present yet and McGonagall was reading correspondence and looking severe about it. Normal. Everything perfectly, suffocatingly normal. Harry picked up a piece of toast and ate it because eating was a thing he was supposed to do and he was good at doing things he was supposed to do. He had built an entire life out of that skill. "There's a new healer," Neville said, settling in next to Ron with the slightly apologetic air he'd never quite shed even though he'd been their friend for 5 years. He meant it as conversation, clearly, the filler kind. Neville still sometimes talked just to make sure there was something to talk about. "Saw him coming out of Madame Pomfrey's office this morning. She looked well chuffed about something." "Healer Aldrich," Hermione said immediately, because of course she already knew. "Tomas Aldrich. He's been assigned by the Department of Magical Health Services. There's been a push to have qualified healers stationed at Hogwarts full-time rather than relying on a school nurse, which isn't to say Madame Pomfrey isn't perfectly competent," she added quickly, in the tone of someone who'd written that exact qualifier into a longer thought and was now performing it, "but a trained St. Mungo's healer is a different qualification entirely." "Did you read that in a pamphlet," Ron said, "or did you just know it?" "Both," Hermione said, without embarrassment. Harry turned the toast over in his hands. Ate another piece. The grey fog was still there, sitting behind his eyes and around his thoughts like a layer of insulation that kept everything at a certain manageable distance. He'd had it for so long he'd stopped questioning it. He'd simply assumed this was what being Harry Potter felt like from the inside, slightly removed from yourself at all times, slightly behind the glass. He assumed, because no one had ever told him otherwise. The toast turned to ash in his mouth. That wasn't metaphor. That was the moment. The egg-white scrambled egg breakfast accumulation of 1,000 mornings moment, when Harry Potter put down his toast, felt the grey fog do something it had never done before, which was pulse, and had approximately 4 seconds to think that strange before the great hall did a slow, elegant roll to the left, the ceiling became the floor, and the floor became nothing at all. He didn't hear himself hit the bench. He didn't hear Hermione scream, though she did, sharp and high, the sound cutting through the breakfast noise like a knife through cloth. He didn't hear Ron shouting his name or Neville knocking over his pumpkin juice in his scramble to get around the table, or the ripple of shocked silence that moved through the student body of Hogwarts in a wave, starting at Gryffindor table and radiating outward until even the Slytherins had gone quiet. He was, for a long and surprisingly peaceful stretch of time, simply not there. The first thing that came back was sound. Voices. Several of them, talking over each other in the way that happened when people were frightened and hiding it behind professionalism. He knew that sound. He'd grown up hearing the Dursleys use that same quality of voice when something went wrong that they didn't want to admit was wrong. Hasn't responded to the standard, "I can see that, Poppy, give me room, been 5 minutes, why isn't he, because something is actively preventing it. Please. Room." That last voice was new. Not McGonagall, not Pomfrey, not Dumbledore, who Harry noted, in the distant way of a person observing their own situation from slightly outside of it, was also somewhere nearby, because he could smell the particular variety of calm authority that Dumbledore seemed to emit the way other people emitted cologne. Lemon drops and old magic and carefully managed concern. The new voice was dry. Precise in the way that good instruments were precise, not flashy, just accurate. Harry opened his eyes. White ceiling. Hospital wing. He was lying on a bed that was both familiar and unwelcome in the way of all hospital beds, and standing over him was a man he'd never seen before, mid-40s, perhaps, with a face that was more interesting than handsome and a healer's lime green robe that had seen enough work to have its own opinions. He was holding a diagnostic instrument Harry didn't recognize, a flat disc about the size of a saucer, made of something that looked like pale silver and was currently producing a soft, steady light that moved like breath. He was frowning at it with the focused unhappiness of a man reading results he had not expected and was not pleased about. "He's awake," Madame Pomfrey said, from his right, immediately pressing forward. She had her professional face on, the contained, efficient expression that Harry had seen her wear through broken bones and Quidditch injuries and the assorted disasters of living near the Whomping Willow, but underneath it was something tighter and more afraid than Harry was used to seeing in her. "Healer Aldrich," Dumbledore said quietly, from behind the man, "perhaps we should allow Harry to, not yet." The healer didn't look away from the disc. His voice wasn't rude exactly, but it carried the absolute disinterest of someone who simply did not have the processing space at this moment for anything that wasn't the problem directly in front of him. "Potter, can you hear me clearly?" "Yes," Harry said. His own voice surprised him, it came out rougher than expected, scraped sounding. "Good. Don't move. Not because you're in danger from moving, but because I want you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you, and I find people retain information better when they're not also attempting to sit up." He was still looking at the disc. "Have you had episodes like this before? Collapse without apparent cause?" "No." Harry paused. "Once in 3rd year, but that was Dementors. Environmental, not intrinsic. Different mechanism." Aldrich finally looked up from the disc, and his eyes, which were a very ordinary grey-brown, settled on Harry with the focused quality of someone who was running multiple calculations simultaneously. "Mr. Potter. I'm going to be direct with you because I think you've probably had enough of people managing what information you receive, and I find that directness in medicine is almost always more useful than comfort. Is that acceptable to you?" Something shifted in Harry's chest. Not the fog, through the fog. A sudden sharp sense of paying attention that he hadn't felt in, he couldn't actually remember the last time he'd felt it. "Yeah," he said. "That's acceptable." "Good." Aldrich set the disc down on the bedside table with the careful placement of someone treating it as evidence. "The diagnostic I ran shows 43 distinct magical constructs attached to your core and your related magical systems. Of those, 3 appear to be of legitimate medical origin. I can identify their signatures and they match standard wizarding pediatric interventions, minor in scope. The remaining 40," he stopped. Looked at Dumbledore very briefly. Looked back at Harry. The remaining 40 are not legitimate, not disclosed, and several of them are classified under Ministry Statute 1847 as illegal binding of a magical minor's core without consent or guardianship authorization. The room was very quiet. Harry stared at the ceiling. 40, he said. 40. Illegal. The majority, yes. Harry was quiet for a moment. In the background, he could hear Pomfrey making a sound that was not quite words and not quite not words, a constrained, tight noise of someone holding a very strong reaction behind professional composure by main force. What do they do? He said. Aldrich picked up the disc again. When he spoke, his voice remained that same dry, accurate instrument, no performance, no softening, just the truth laid out in order. The construct spans several categories. There are 5 core suppressants, those limit the raw volume of magic available to you at any given moment. Think of your core as a reservoir, these constructs have gates on it, holding the water level artificially low. There are 7 cognitive filters, a more delicate type of binding that targets specific types of analytical processing. Pattern recognition, primarily. Strategic thinking. The kind of cognitive functions that would allow you to, say, assess a situation from multiple angles simultaneously. A small pause. There are 11 emotional dampeners. Those are, frankly, those are the ones I find most troubling from a clinical standpoint. They target effect broadly, blunting emotional response across the spectrum, positive and negative both, with particular emphasis on, he checked the disc, anger, confidence, and what I can only describe as a composite that seems engineered to specifically reduce the likelihood of self-assertion. Harry's hands were very still on the blanket. Keep going, he said. 8 magical skill inhibitors, these attach themselves to the developmental nodes in magical circuitry, the structures that govern how quickly and intuitively new magical skills are acquired. Without them, your learning curve for new spells and techniques should be considerably steeper than it apparently has been. There are also 6 memory constructs. These are more targeted. They appear to have been placed with precision, suppressing specific memory complexes rather than general retention. I can't tell you yet what memories without a deeper scan, but the architectural style suggests the targeting was deliberate. Aldrich set the disc down a second time. And finally, 3 constructs I can only describe as identity anchors. This is a rare and very old type of magic. They don't block or suppress anything specific. They orient you. Compel, gently but consistently, a particular self-concept. In this case, a self-concept structured around, I want to choose my words carefully here, smallness. Compliance. The absence of the belief that you have the right to take up space. Madame Pomfrey made the noise again. This time it resolved into a word, Merlin. Dumbledore said nothing. Harry lay very still. The grey fog, the insulation, the glass, was still there, but for the first time he was looking at it from the outside. Understanding what it was. It wasn't him. It was never him. It was a room built around him, and he'd spent 15 years thinking the room was his own skin. Who? Harry said. The word came out flat and even, which was not how he felt, but he'd spent a long time learning to make his voice flat and even. That's a question I will be able to answer more fully once I've completed the detailed analysis, Aldrich said. Magical constructs carry signature traces, most of these will be identifiable to their caster. That analysis will take several hours. What I can tell you right now is that no single person cast all of these. The signatures I can already identify suggest, his eyes moved again, briefly, toward Dumbledore. Multiple casters, over a span of several years. The earliest appears to have been placed when you were approximately 14 months old. Before Voldemort, Harry said. Yes. Harry closed his eyes. Opened them. The ceiling was the same. Can they be removed? He said. Yes. Aldrich's voice carried the particular confidence of a man speaking in his area of absolute competence. Removal is achievable. It will need to be done in stages. Removing 40 constructs simultaneously would create a magical surge that, frankly, I would not want to manage in a hospital wing not equipped for it. In stages, over the course of several days, it should be manageable. Uncomfortable. But manageable. How uncomfortable, Harry said. Like removing a set of splints that your body has grown around, Godric said. Some of your magical and cognitive processes have adapted to working within the constraints. As the constraints are removed, the processes will expand and recalibrate. It won't be painless, but it will be productive pain. The kind that means something is working correctly. Right. Harry looked at the diagnostic disc. Can you remove one now? One of the smaller ones. I want to know what it feels like. Harry, Dumbledore said, and there was something in his voice that Harry had never heard there before, not quite alarm, not quite the warm uncle-ish gravity that was his default register, but something that lived between them, in the space where a person's careful management of a situation encounters the moment the situation stops cooperating. Harry turned his head and looked at Dumbledore for the first time since waking up. The old man was standing at the foot of his bed, blue eyes serious above the half-moon spectacles, magnificent and silver-bearded and absolutely radiating the impression of calm authority that Harry had spent 5 years finding instinctively reassuring. He was not finding it reassuring at this moment. Yeah. Harry said. Just the one word, with nothing in it except a question. Dumbledore held his gaze for a moment. I think it would be wise to, Healer Godric. Harry turned away from Dumbledore. I'd like you to remove one. The smallest one you're confident about. I'm consenting as the patient. As the whatever. Primary affected party. Godric looked at him for one long moment, and then he picked up the diagnostic disc. You're certain? I'm certain. Godric nodded. He wasn't asking for confirmation from anyone else in the room, and the fact that he wasn't asking for confirmation from anyone else in the room, that he was simply treating Harry as the relevant authority on decisions about Harry's own body, created a feeling in Harry's chest that he couldn't immediately name and suspected might be something he hadn't been allowed to feel clearly enough to name before. The most straightforward removal is one of the skill inhibitors, Godric said, angling the disc with the focused attention of a surgeon. This particular construct is fairly recent, within the last 2 years, and its anchoring points are on the surface of your primary magical circuitry rather than embedded in the deeper structures. Removal should be quick. You'll feel, just do it, Harry said. Godric pressed 2 fingers to a specific point on the disc and spoke a quiet, methodical phrase in a Latin that Harry didn't fully recognize, medical Latin, technical and stripped of performance. The disc pulsed once, gold-white, and Harry felt the fog crack. Not break. Not disappear. Crack, in a single, specific, vertical line, the way ice cracks when you press your thumb into it at the right angle, and through that crack came sensation, not a specific emotion, not yet, but the raw capacity for sensation, a sudden aperture opening in a wall that had always been solid, and Harry pulled in a breath like he was surfacing from water. Oh, he said. Yes, Godric said. Harry's hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the blanket and looked at them with the focused, slightly bewildered attention of a person watching something happen to their own body from the outside. The shaking wasn't fear. He understood that immediately. It was more like structural adjustment. The way a muscle shakes after you've been tensing it for a very long time and finally let go. That was one, he said. That was one, Godric confirmed. 39 remaining. Harry lay there for a moment, breathing, and something that might have been himself, the first approximation of something that might have been himself, moved through the new crack in the grey fog and looked around with the curious bewilderment of a person emerging from a room they'd been in so long they'd forgotten it had a door. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at his hands. He looked at Dumbledore. I want to know everything, he said. Every binding. Every name. Every reason. I want to know all of it. His voice was still level, still even. But it was level in a different way than before, not the flatness of suppression, but the steadiness of a person who has decided something and is not negotiating. And I want to know it before anyone makes any decisions about anything else. Pomfrey, who had been standing at the edge of the scene like a person who wanted very much to say things but was exercising extraordinary restraint, made her move. She stepped forward, placed herself visibly at Harry's right, not behind him, not at a careful distance, but adjacent and present in a way that communicated something without requiring speech, and looked at Dumbledore with an expression that Harry had never seen on Madame Pomfrey's face in 5 years of Hogwarts. "I think," she said, in a voice that had the surface texture of professional neutrality and was made of something considerably harder underneath, "that Harry's request is entirely reasonable. Healer Aldrich," she turned to him, "what is your recommendation as the attending clinician?" "My recommendation," Aldrich said, without hesitation, "is full disclosure to the patient, complete analytical report, and a phased removal schedule beginning as soon as the analysis is complete." He looked at Dumbledore. Not unkindly. Not confrontationally. Simply directly. "The patient is 15 years old, not a legal minor under magical majority statutes for core medical decisions once they involve their own person's integrity, and he has consented. The question of whether anyone else in this room additionally consents is not, clinically relevant." The sentence landed in the room like a stone into still water, and the ripples were interesting. Dumbledore looked at Harry. There was something moving behind his eyes, not the warmth, not the managed calm, but something more genuine and less comfortable, the expression of a man watching a plan that was built with the best of intentions encounter the full weight of its own consequences. "Harry," he said. "I would very much like to speak with you privately before." "No," Harry said. "One word. Not shouted. Not heated. Perfectly, firmly, unambiguously no." He watched something shift in Dumbledore's face, watched the extraordinary old man, who had managed kingdoms and wars and the terrifying machinery of fate with serene authority, encounter the small, implacable refusal of a 15-year-old boy who had just had the first crack of light let into a room that had always been dark, and who was not yet fully himself but was already far more himself than he'd been this morning, and who understood, with a clarity that even one removed binding had apparently been enough to let through, that privately in this context meant without witnesses, and he had spent enough of his life being managed without witnesses. The answer was no. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "Very well," he said. He settled into the chair at the end of the bed, and Harry noticed, for the first time in all their meetings, all their conversations, all the moments in this man's office surrounded by quietly whirring instruments and sleeping portraits, that Dumbledore looked old. Not magisterial. Not timeless. Old, in the way of a person carrying weight that has finally caught up to them. "Healer Aldrich," Harry said, turning away from Dumbledore again with the deliberate ease of a person filing something for later, "tell me about the memory constructs." Hermione was not in the habit of standing in corridors wringing her hands, because she found it an inefficient use of both time and energy. She was, instead, sitting on the bench outside the hospital wing, back straight, hands folded in her lap, and running the same series of logical chains over and over in her mind in the fruitless and unsatisfying way of a person who doesn't have enough information but cannot stop trying to process anyway. Ron was pacing. "Could you?" she said. "No," Ron said, without stopping. Neville was sitting on the floor across from them, knees pulled up, looking genuinely distressed in the open, uncomplicated way that Neville experienced all his emotions. "He'll be okay," Neville said, and it was clearly meant as comfort but came out instead as a question. "Of course he will," Hermione said, in the tone she used when she needed something to be true. "You heard what McGonagall said." Ron stopped pacing. His face was doing the thing, the tight, jaw-set, eye-bright thing it did when Ron was furious and trying to be controlled about it. "An emergency diagnostic. That's not nothing, Hermione. That's something actually wrong." "I'm aware of that, Ron. He's been off for weeks." "I know. Months, actually. Since last year. And we kept saying, I know what we kept saying." Her voice came out sharper than she intended, which was a sign that she was frightened, which she was, and which she generally addressed by becoming more precise rather than less. We kept saying he was tired and stressed and dealing with Voldemort and the tournament and a dozen other things that would make anyone. She stopped. We weren't wrong to think that. We weren't wrong, Ron said carefully, but we might have been missing something. They sat with that. From inside the hospital wing, nothing was audible. The door was thick, and whatever was happening in there was happening in a silence that felt, from the outside, extremely full. McGonagall appeared at the corridor end, brisk and precise as always, but with something around her eyes that Hermione didn't like the look of. She swept past them, knocked once on the hospital wing door, and was admitted without explanation. Ron watched her go. Right, he said, and sat down next to Hermione. Right, well. He stretched his legs out in front of him. Whatever it is, we'll sort it. Hermione nodded. She believed him, which was strange, because Ron Weasley was not objectively the most capable person she'd ever met, but there was something about the unassailable certainty with which he stated things like we'll sort it that had the quality of prophecy. He didn't eat breakfast, she said. He hasn't been sleeping. Last week in defense I watched him cast a Protego and it was, Ron, it was barely holding. Harry's shield charm is usually brilliant, you know it is. But it was thin. Like he was pushing against something. Ron was quiet for a moment. Like something was pushing back. Yes, Hermione said. Exactly like that. They looked at the door. We'll sort it, Ron said again. Healer Aldrich worked through the afternoon. The analysis he'd promised was thorough in the way that only a person with genuine professional pride in their discipline could be thorough, not perfunctory, not performing diligence, but actually going through each of the 40 constructs with the focused attention of someone who understood that the report he was building was a document that would matter enormously. McGonagall sat in the corner. She had arrived, looked at the situation with the complete assessment of a person who processes information rapidly and completely, said precisely nothing, and taken a chair. She had been in it ever since. Her expression, which Pomfrey privately thought was the most precisely calibrated expression of suppressed anger she'd ever seen on a human face, had not changed. Dumbledore was still at the foot of Harry's bed. Harry was sitting up now. Someone, Pomfrey, who was quietly and efficiently doing the 100 small practical things she did in her infirmary to avoid allowing herself to simply stand there being horrified, had brought him tea and he was holding it in both hands, which was less about drinking it and more about having something to do with his hands while he listened to Aldrich work through the analysis. The diagnostic disc now had a companion, a longer, flatter instrument that Aldrich was using to run sequential readings on each construct, and as he completed each one he annotated it with a brief verbal summary that Harry listened to with the unblinking, total attention of a person who is filing every word somewhere deep and permanent. Construct 7, Cognitive Filter, Class B Suppression, Targeting Spatial and Tactical Reasoning, Aldrich said, in the steady cadence of a man reading a legal document. Signature trace indicates a single caster. Glyph composition is, consistent with Hogwarts-era training, likely cast by a competent mid to advanced practitioner. A pause. There is a secondary marker embedded in the anchoring structure that I'll need to cross-reference, but the primary signature is clear. Whose? Harry said. The cross-reference will confirm it, but, Aldrich looked at him. My preliminary read is a double signature. 2 casters working in concert on this one, each providing half the anchoring. A construct that complex requires that kind of collaboration to hold. Dumbledore's hands, folded in his lap, were very still. McGonagall's quill moved in her notebook. She was taking notes. She had been taking notes since she arrived. How many of the 40 have Hogwarts-era signatures? Harry said. Aldrich ran the longer instrument down the sequence. 18. And the ones from when I was 14 months old? 4. Those 4 show significantly older glyph architecture, not just in style but in magical theory. They're built on a framework that fell out of common use in the early part of this century. I'll be honest with you, Potter, whoever placed those was working from either very old texts or very specialized training. The intent is preservation adjacent. He paused. Meaning the original caster may have believed they were protecting you, in some sense, from something they feared you might otherwise become. Or feared I'd be able to do, Harry said. Aldrich looked at him. Said nothing. Which was, Harry thought, a kind of answer. He drank some of the tea. It was the first thing he'd tasted clearly all day, properly tasted, the warmth of it and the slight bitterness, hitting his senses without the layer of muted distance that he'd always assumed was just life. Just how things tasted when you were him. He thought of the scrambled eggs this morning and felt something that wasn't quite grief but was adjacent to it, the way you felt when you realized you'd missed something and couldn't go back. He set the grief aside. Later. There would be time for later. The identity anchors, he said. The three. Tell me more about those. Aldrich's expression, which had maintained its professional containment throughout the analysis, did something small and complicated. The identity anchors are, architecturally, they're the most sophisticated constructs on this list. Whoever designed them understood something quite deep about how identity is structured in magical beings, how a person's sense of self interacts with their magical output, how the two systems reinforce each other. The anchors are layered through both simultaneously, which is why they're more insidious than a simple suppressor. He turned the instrument. They work through suggestion rather than direct suppression. They don't prevent you from feeling confidence, they simply make any confidence you do feel seem illegitimate. Unearned. Dangerous, even. They made me feel like I was too big for my own thoughts, Harry said. Aldrich looked at him. Yes, he said. That's a very accurate description of the mechanism. The room was quiet. And then Dumbledore said, with the soft and genuine weight of a man who has been waiting for a conversation for a long time and finds that its arrival is not a relief, Harry. I owe you an explanation. Harry looked at him. Yes, he said. You do. And I intend to give you one. I need you to understand, not here, Harry said. Not today. He held the old man's gaze without any of the reflexive deference that had always been there before, that particular quality of careful respect that the identity anchors had apparently been very helpful in maintaining. Today, I want to finish the analysis. I want to understand what was done to me. Your explanation can wait until I have all the information, because I'm not going to listen to a reason for any of this until I know the full extent of what the reason is supposed to cover. McGonagall made a sound that might, in a different acoustical register, have been agreement. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long moment, and then he nodded. A single, small nod that carried with it something that looked, unexpectedly, almost like respect. Of course, he said quietly. Harry turned back to Aldrich. The memory constructs. I want to know what I can't remember. Aldrich pulled the diagnostic disc back into position. To fully identify the targeted complexes, I'll need to do a direct memory trace, that's a deeper scan, requires more contact, and it'll be disorienting. The blocked memories won't restore tonight, removal of those constructs is a slower process than the skill inhibitors. But the trace will tell us the category and rough content of what's been suppressed. Do it, Harry said. Harry, Pomfrey said, from behind him, and her voice had come unstuck from professional and was simply worried and human and tired, you've already had one removal today, and the analysis alone is, Madam Pomfrey. He said it gently. Not dismissively. I'm not going to sleep tonight without knowing. Help me be sure about what I'm not sleeping about. She was quiet for a moment. Fine, she said, in the voice of a person who disagrees but respects the argument. But when Healer Aldrich says it's enough for one night, I'll be backing him, and you'll listen. Yes, ma'am, Harry said. Aldrich placed the disc against the side of Harry's head, just above his temple, and ran the memory trace. What Harry saw was not images, exactly. Not clear recollections restored. It was more like shapes in fog. Outlines. The ghost of dimensions, showing him the shapes of things that had existed without letting him access the things themselves. 6 distinct complexes, each one carved out with the same precise, awful care, and as Aldrich named them one by one, a significant emotional memory complex, dated approximately ages 6 to 8, a magical self-discovery complex. This one is large, suggests major incidents that would have been formative to magical identity, a relationship trust complex, targeted to specific individuals, indicating memory of interactions that the construct's architect wished to reframe or eliminate entirely. A threat recognition complex. This is interesting, this would have affected your ability to accurately assess risk from certain quarters. This one is unusual, it's a capabilities complex, specifically targeting your own perception of your magical skill relative to others. And I'm going to describe this carefully. A grief complex. Very large. Rooted in early childhood and extending forward. Suppressing grief along with the contextual memories that created it. Harry sat very still. The grief complex, he said. What does early childhood grief look like for me? Aldrich looked at him steadily. I can't access the content. But the scale of it, he paused. You lost your parents at 14 months. The construct seems to have been placed, carefully, over whatever that meant to you at a developmental level. Not the knowledge that they died. The emotional reality of what that meant. Something moved through Harry then, not from the crack in the fog, this was the fog itself shifting, the entire construct trembling at the edges around the new aperture, and he felt something that was too large to name push against the inside of the glass and he breathed through it, long and steady, until it settled. Right, he said, eventually. He set the empty teacup down on the bedside table. Right, he said again. So. He looked at Aldrich. Removal starts tomorrow. Full schedule. As fast as is safely manageable. Agreed, Aldrich said. I'll be in every day. Expected. And I want the full caster analysis the moment it's done. He looked at Dumbledore. At McGonagall. At Pomfrey. All of it. Every name. Nobody argued. Then I'm going to sleep, he said. He lay back against the pillow and looked at the ceiling, and the grey fog was still there, cracked in one place, trembling at the edges now, but still there, still the insulating wrong texture of everything he'd always known, and he thought, tomorrow. One day. One binding out of 40 removed, and already the world felt like a slightly different world. Like a picture brought marginally more into focus. Like the difference between looking at something through glass and looking at it through an open window. He couldn't imagine 39 more. He was going to find out anyway. In the corridor, Ron was still sitting on the bench when Pomfrey opened the door at 9 o'clock to let them in for a brief visit, and he was on his feet before the door was fully open, and whatever he saw on Harry's face when he came in, not fine, not managed, but present, awake in a way that Ron registered immediately as different without being able to say why, made him cross the room without a word and sit down next to the bed and say, very simply, tell me. And Harry did. Not everything. Not all of it, not yet, because not all of it was clear enough to tell. But the shape of it. The number. The categories. The crack in the fog. Hermione listened with the particular quality of stillness she had when she was processing something too large for her to immediately rationalize, and twice her eyes went bright in the way that meant she was very close to crying but refusing to, and Harry watched her and felt something that was still muted but was more than it had been this morning, a warmth, real and present, like a fire seen from the other side of the glass. Ron didn't cry. Ron went very, very quiet, in the specific way Ron went quiet when he was so angry that noise seemed insufficient. His hands, resting on his knees, curled slowly into fists and then deliberately, consciously uncurled, and he looked at Harry with an expression that was many things at once and on top of all of them was simply, I know. I believe you. I'm here. 40, Hermione said, finally, in a very small voice. 40. Since 14 months, some of them, yeah. She was quiet for a long time. Harry, she stopped. Tried again. I kept thinking you just needed more study time. In defense. I kept giving you additional reading and I thought, Hermione. He said her name the same way he'd said Pomfrey's, not dismissive, but grounded. You didn't know. Nobody told you to know. I should have, how? Ron said, and it wasn't harsh, it was just the clean cut of a question that didn't have a comfortable answer. How were you supposed to know something was wrong with his magic when he's been like this since you met him? His baseline was already, this was already what he was like. You can't see the floor of something you've never seen without a ceiling. Hermione looked at Ron. Something passed between them that was less about Harry and more about the two of them, the small private acknowledgement of a partnership that often expressed itself most clearly in these moments when one of them said the thing the other had been trying to find. The ceiling comes off tomorrow, Harry said. He was looking at the enchanted ceiling of the hospital wing, not the Great Hall one. This one didn't do weather, just gentle light that dimmed as evening deepened, and his voice had the quality it got when he was deciding something. And I want to know who built it. I want to know every single person who decided to make me smaller than I was supposed to be, and I want them to explain it to my face. Ron nodded, once, like someone ratifying a declaration. We'll be here, he said. In the morning. I know, Harry said. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, being told someone would be there didn't feel like a courtesy. It felt like what it was, a fact, solid and reliable, that his mind, slowly, carefully, through the first hair-thin crack in 40 layers of fog, was finally able to hold. Chapter 2, The Accounting. Harry woke at 5 in the morning with the particular clarity of someone whose brain has decided that sleep is finished and further negotiation is pointless. He lay still for a moment, cataloging the difference. Yesterday morning, before the Great Hall, before the diagnostic disc, before the first crack in the fog, waking up had felt like surfacing through mud. A slow, reluctant emergence into a world that always seemed slightly too loud, slightly too demanding, the way a noise too close to your ear feels. This morning there was none of that. He opened his eyes and he was simply awake, present in the room with a sharpness that felt foreign and correct simultaneously, the way your handwriting looks strange after you've been writing with your non-dominant hand for long enough that going back to the other one feels new. He sat up. The hospital wing was gray and quiet in the pre-dawn, the enchanted lights still in their nighttime dimness. Down the row of beds, nothing stirred. Pomfrey's office door was closed. The diagnostic disc was sitting on the bedside table where Godric had left it, dormant now, its surface dull and silver. Harry picked it up. He turned it over in his hands. It was lighter than it looked, almost weightless, constructed of something that was probably not actually silver but had that quality of material that existed primarily in the intersection between magic and metallurgy. He could feel, and this was new, this was part of what the first removal had apparently unlocked, a faint resonance in it. Not warmth exactly. More like the sense of a struck tuning fork, a vibration just below the threshold of sound, the instrument having absorbed enough diagnostic work yesterday to carry an echo of it. He put it down and reached for his glasses. Looked around the room. Thought about going back to sleep, which his body suggested might be sensible and his mind rejected with complete finality. He thought about the 39 remaining bindings. He thought about 14 months old. A child. Someone had stood over a child 14 months old and built structures into his magical core with the precision of an architect and the calm deliberation of someone who had decided the outcome before they began the work. Someone had looked at a baby and thought, this needs to be smaller. He thought about that for a while and let it sit where it was, because the anger that came with it was the cleanest emotion he'd felt since he could remember and he wasn't going to rush it. It deserved to be looked at properly. At 5:30, Godric arrived. He came in through the main door in his lime green robes, carrying a leather case that moved with the faint clinking of instruments, and stopped when he saw Harry sitting up, awake, watching him cross the room. "You've been up for a while," Godric said. It wasn't a question. "Hour or so," Harry said. Godric set the case down, opened it, and began arranging instruments on the bedside table with the methodical efficiency of someone who had a sequence and was following it. "How do you feel?" "Clearer than yesterday," Harry said. "More awake than usual." "Like something's," he tried to find the word for it. "Like something's been running at half speed my whole life and someone bumped it up a fraction." Aldrich nodded. "That's consistent with what I'd expect from removing one skill inhibitor. The cognitive and emotional constructs will have more pronounced effects when they come off. The core suppressants will be," he considered, "physical, more than cognitive. You'll feel those in your magic rather than your head." "When do we start?" "After I complete the caster analysis." Aldrich pulled the diagnostic disc toward him and connected it to a secondary instrument Harry hadn't seen before, a thin rod of pale wood with a crystalline tip, which he began running along the disc's surface in slow, precise passes. "I started the cross-referencing last night after you were asleep. I have preliminary results." Harry waited. Aldrich ran 2 more passes with the rod. The crystal tip shifted color, amber, then a deeper gold, then back to clear, and he noted something in a small leather-bound journal that he produced from his breast pocket. "I'm going to give you this information because you asked for it and you have the right to it," Aldrich said, without looking up from the disc. "I'll also be submitting a full clinical report to the Department of Magical Health Services, which is a mandatory obligation under wizarding medical law when illegal bindings of this magnitude are discovered. That report goes regardless of anyone's preferences on the matter." A brief pause. "I want you to understand that before I tell you the names, so you know that the legal mechanism is already in motion independently of anything you choose to do." "Okay," Harry said. "The 4 constructs from your infancy, the ones I flagged as pre-Voldemort, early architecture, carry a signature I've identified. It's complex, doubly anchored, very old style." Aldrich looked up. "The primary caster is Albus Dumbledore." The room was quiet. Harry absorbed this the same way he'd absorbed the number 40 yesterday, not with shock, because the shape of it had been forming since he'd watched Dumbledore's face go careful and still in the moment the diagnostic results came in, and Harry's threat recognition complex was apparently still suppressed, but even through the fog he'd always had something that tracked intent, some survival instinct that Privet Drive had honed to a fine edge. "You learned, in that house, to read a room before the room read you." "And the Hogwarts-era ones," he said. Aldrich returned to the disc. "The constructs placed during your time here span several casters. The emotional dampeners, all 11 of them, show a consistent signature. Same hand, placed at intervals across your first 4 years here, with the most recent placed at the end of your 4th year." He paused. "That signature is Severus Snape." Harry let out a slow breath. "Of course it is," he said. Not heated. Not even particularly surprised. Snape's particular quality of hatred had always felt like it had too much energy in it for simple dislike. There was something architectural about the way Snape managed Harry, something that had structure and intent beneath the surface contempt. It made a certain awful sense. "The cognitive filters, 7 of them, show a different signature on each anchor point," Aldrich continued. "Multiple casters. I've identified 3 with confidence. Dumbledore again, on 2 of them. One shows a minister-registered signature. I can pull the name from the records." He checked the journal. "Alastair Moody." "Moody," Harry said. "Or Barty Crouch Jr." Aldrich looked up sharply. "4th year," Harry said. "Someone impersonated Moody for the entire year. Death Eater. Would have had access to me." Aldrich held his gaze for a moment, then made a note. "I'll flag that construct for additional analysis. The signature matches a registered identity, but if the registered identity was being impersonated at the time of casting, that complicates the attribution considerably." "The memory constructs," Harry said. "Who built those?" Aldrich's expression did the same small, complicated thing it had done yesterday when Harry had asked about the identity anchors. 4 of the 6 memory constructs show Dumbledore's signature. The grief complex, the threat recognition complex, and 2 of the capability complexes. He closed the journal. The remaining two, the emotional memory complex from your early childhood and the relationship trust complex, show a signature I don't have in the standard reference records. It's very fine work. Very old technique. Whoever this caster was, they had specialized training that isn't commonly available. Someone who knew my parents, Harry said. Possibly. Or someone in Dumbledore's immediate circle with access to the same body of knowledge. Aldrich paused. I want to be clear about something, Potter. The fact that Dumbledore's signature appears on the largest number of constructs doesn't necessarily indicate that he acted alone, or even that he was the architect of all of them. Several of these appear to have been placed at his direction, or with his knowledge, by other casters. That doesn't reduce his responsibility. But it suggests a coordinated effort rather than a single person's project. A coordinated effort to make me, Harry stopped. To make me manageable. He said it plainly, without heat, which was more devastating than anger would have been. Aldrich said nothing, which was his method of confirming things he didn't want to put into the shape of direct speech. How long until you're ready to start the next removal? Harry said. An hour. I need to complete the sequence analysis so I know which constructs to remove in which order. You can't simply pull them out randomly. The structural dependencies mean that removing a deep anchor before removing a surface construct it supports could create a cascade that, I trust your sequence, Harry said. An hour. An hour, Aldrich confirmed. Harry threw back the covers, swung his legs over the side of the bed, and stood up. He stood there for a moment, just standing, feeling the floor under his feet and the cool air of the hospital wing and the particular quality of being vertical and awake and present. Here. He'd been half somewhere else for so long that being all the way in a room felt like a new skill. He picked up his wand from the bedside table. He'd had this wand for 5 years. Holly, 11 inches, Phoenix feather core, he'd been told it was unusual, told it had a brother wand, told it chose him in a way that made Ollivander go still with something like recognition. He'd never questioned what chosen meant, because he'd been working with the version of himself that had been built to not question things like that. He held it now, and he felt the resonance in it, cleaner than yesterday, less insulated, the connection between his hand and the channel of the wand sitting a fraction closer to where it belonged, and without thinking about it, without choosing a spell, without the particular careful deliberate effort of a student executing a known technique, he let something just move. A small thing. A cushion on the nearest bed shifted 2 feet to the left, smooth and effortless, without a spoken word. He stood there looking at it. Without a spoken word. He'd done wandless magic before, bits of accidental childhood magic, the glass in the snake enclosure, the roof of the school when Dudley's gang was after him. But he'd never done it consciously, deliberately, casually. And the effort involved, or rather the absolute lack of effort, was the most disorienting thing that had happened since yesterday, which was a field with significant competition. He pointed his wand at the cushion and sent it back where it was, spoke and intentional this time, and the spell ran down the wand with a quality of speed and precision that his magic had never had before. Not visibly different. Not spectacular. But he felt it, he felt the difference, the way you feel the difference between a door that sticks and a door with well-oiled hinges. Same door. Same effort. Completely different experience. 39 more to go. He went and had a shower. When Dumbledore arrived at 8 o'clock, he found Harry sitting up in bed, Aldrich already working on the second removal, and Hermione and Ron, who Pomfrey had apparently allowed in under the heading of exceptional circumstances and who were now installed in chairs on either side of the bed with the settled permanence of people who had no intention of leaving, sitting quietly while Aldrich explained what he was doing. Dumbledore stopped in the doorway. Harry looked at him. "Professor," he said, in a voice that was perfectly civil and empty of warmth. "Have a seat." Dumbledore came in. He did not take the chair at the foot of the bed this time, instead he moved to the window, which Pomfrey had cracked open to let in the morning air, and stood there for a moment with his back to the room, his robes pooling on the floor in that particular way of people who wear robes so habitually they've become structural. McGonagall arrived 2 minutes later. She had the leather notebook from last night. She sat down. Snape arrived at 9. He came through the door with his usual particular quality of controlled motion, that contained, deliberate way of moving through space as if his body was a thing he managed rather than inhabited, and his face was the face he always wore, the blank professional contempt that Harry had spent 5 years reading as directed specifically at him and was now, with the emerging clarity of one inhibitor removed and the second removal well underway, rereading as directed more broadly inward. Snape's face, Harry thought, was the face of a man who had made himself unreadable as a survival strategy so early and so completely that he'd forgotten what the original expressions looked like. The second removal finished. Harry felt it go, a release in his chest, clean and sharp, like a knot being cut, and in its wake a sudden vivid increase in the resolution of everything around him. Not literally, not his eyesight, but the quality of information he was receiving, the sense of being able to track multiple things simultaneously without losing any of them. He looked at Snape with this newly sharpened faculty and saw, underneath the mask, that Snape knew why he'd been summoned. "Sit down, Severus," Dumbledore said, from the window. Snape sat. He did not look at Harry. Aldrich set the diagnostic disc down, made a note in his sequence journal, and looked around the room. "Before we continue the removal schedule, I think the situation warrants an explanation of what's been found." He was addressing the room, not performing for anyone in particular. "I'll keep the clinical summary brief. Potter has already received the full version. The material fact is that this patient has 40 illegal magical constructs attached to his core and associated systems, placed over a period of approximately 14 years, by multiple casters, without consent. That is the position we are currently in." He let that sit. "Healer Aldrich." Dumbledore turned from the window. He looked, in the morning light, every one of his 150 years. "I would like to offer, with respect, Headmaster," Aldrich said, "the clinical summary is not a conversation. It's a record of findings. You're welcome to speak after it's complete." He returned to his journal. "The casters I've identified include the headmaster, Professor Snape, and at least one additional unidentified practitioner. A fourth signature, initially attributed to Alastor Moody, is flagged for review given the events of Potter's 4th year. The removal schedule I've designed will address the constructs in sequence over the next 4 days, beginning this morning." He closed the journal. "That's the summary." Silence. Then McGonagall said, in a voice that was so completely quiet it had the quality of something structural, something load-bearing, "Albus. I want to hear it from you." The word Albus was not something Harry had heard McGonagall use before. It sat in the room differently than the usual headmaster, closer, weightier, the word of a person speaking to someone they've known for a very long time and from whom they expected better. Dumbledore looked at her. Then he looked at Harry. "I will explain everything," he said. "But I would like to begin by acknowledging, unambiguously and without qualification, that what was done was wrong." "Good start," Ron said. Hermione made a small sharp gesture in his direction. He shrugged and subsided. Dumbledore moved to a chair and sat, not the foot of the bed, not the window, but the chair beside McGonagall's, in the cluster of people rather than at its edge, which was perhaps deliberate and perhaps the most honest spatial arrangement he'd made. "What I tell you now, I tell you without expectation of forgiveness, because I don't believe forgiveness can be earned by explanation. It can only be offered freely, and that is entirely Harry's to decide." "Stop managing it," Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. "You're already managing how it sounds," Harry said. "The framing. The preemptive absolution language so that when the actual explanation comes it sounds like wisdom. Stop." His voice was still even, it was always even now, the evenness of a person who has chosen calm rather than been suppressed into it. "Just tell me what you did and why." Another small silence. Then Dumbledore said, "When Voldemort fell, the night he attacked your family, I knew 2 things immediately. The first was that you had survived by means I didn't fully understand, that the magic involved was ancient and powerful and had marked you in ways I couldn't yet quantify. The second was that Voldemort was not gone. Not truly. I believed with absolute certainty, that he would return. So, Harry said. So I was faced with a choice. A boy who had survived through extraordinary power, carrying a connection to the most dangerous dark wizard of the age, who would one day have to face him again. And I had to decide. He paused. Genuinely paused, Harry thought, not for performance but because he was actually trying to find the honest version of what came next. I had to decide what kind of boy would have the best chance of surviving that encounter. Of winning it. And you decided, Harry said, that the best chance was a small one. I decided that a boy who knew his own power, who grew up aware of the magnitude of what he carried, would be too large a target. Voldemort had his own intelligence network, his own means of assessment. A child openly displaying a magical signature of that significance would have been killed, Harry said. Yes. So you bound 40% of my capacity. The intention was, I know what the intention was. Harry looked at him steadily. The intention was to protect me by making me less. By making me someone who couldn't threaten him until the moment I was supposed to. So he wouldn't see me coming. A pause. The problem with that logic is that the bindings didn't stop when I needed to be ready. They kept going. New ones, every year. Right up through last year. Dumbledore was quiet. Why were new ones added in fourth year? Harry asked. Snape's hands, folded on his knees, shifted. Severus, Dumbledore said. The room turned toward Snape. Snape was looking at the floor. Harry watched his face. This was the strange new quality of having two inhibitors removed, this sharpness of observation, because he could see clearly for the first time that Snape's expression was not content right now. It was something older and more complicated and less comfortable to look at. In your fourth year, Snape said, at the floor, when Voldemort returned to a body, I received information that his assessment of you had changed. He had seen the power displayed in the graveyard. He knew you were stronger than expected. He was speaking in the clipped, precise mode of a man giving a report because report mode kept the personal distance intact. The headmaster and I made the decision to reinforce the suppression before the start of fifth year. To prevent Voldemort from revising his strategy based on what he'd seen. And it didn't occur to either of you, Ron said, with the deceptive mildness of someone controlling their voice very carefully, that he'd almost died in that graveyard? That maybe the year he faced Voldemort again was the year he needed to be more capable, not less. Mr. Weasley, Dumbledore began. No, Ron said. I'm asking him. He was looking at Snape. You were there. In Dumbledore's meetings. You made the decision. Didn't the fact that Voldemort had just come back and Harry was going to need to fight him again at some point, didn't that make the binding seem like a bad idea? Snape looked up. He looked at Ron, then at Harry, and Harry held his gaze without any of the usual complicated antagonism, just looked at him clear and steady and waited. I believed, Snape said, and for the first time in Harry's memory his voice had nothing in it that was performing, no edge of theatrical contempt, just the bare unattractive texture of a man telling the truth he wishes were different, that if the Dark Lord perceived Potter as a significant magical threat, the risk of assassination would outweigh any strategic advantage from restored capability. I believed we needed more time. That the bindings were temporary. Were they going to be removed before I faced him? Harry asked. Silence. Were they? Harry pressed. Dumbledore said, quietly, that was my intention. Yes. When? When I determined you were ready. You determined, Harry said. Not me. You. Yes, Dumbledore said, and to his credit, and Harry was tracking credits and debits here with a precision that the removed inhibitors had apparently sharpened considerably, to his credit he did not dress it up. He said yes and let it stand there undressed. McGonagall's quill was moving. The memory constructs, Harry said. The grief. My parents. You suppressed my ability to, what? To feel what it meant that they died. Dumbledore's expression moved, something crossed it that was the most genuine thing Harry had seen from him since this began. Not the warm uncle gravity. Not the managed calm. Actual pain, the kind that's been carried long enough to have worn grooves in the carrier. That one, he stopped. That one I placed when you were 2 years old. You were living at Privet Drive. I had made the decision to place you there for the blood protections, and I visited, once. To confirm you were, adjusting. A pause. You were not adjusting. You were grieving in the way that a 2-year-old grieves, which is total and consuming and, he stopped again. I told myself I was being merciful. You told yourself, Harry said. Yes. And you kept telling yourself that for 13 years. The weight of that sat in the room and nobody rushed to move it. Harry looked at the window. The morning was bright and ordinary outside, the castle grounds catching the early June light the way they always did, green and gold and permanent, Hogwarts in summer beginning like a promise. He looked at it and felt something move through him, not anger, not grief, something more complex that he didn't have a name for yet and suspected he wouldn't have a name for until more of the bindings were gone and he had access to the full range of what he was capable of feeling. I have more questions, he said, still looking out the window. About the identity anchors. About who the unidentified caster is. About the relationship trust complex, specifically which relationships it was targeting. He turned back to the room. But I want to do the next removal first. Aldrich was already reaching for the disc. If you're all staying, he addressed the room without ceremony, stay quiet while I work. Nobody moved to leave. The third removal was one of the emotional dampeners. Harry had been warned it would be more physical than the first two, and Aldrich's description of productive pain turned out to be accurate in the way that medical descriptions of unpleasant things are always accurate, technically correct and experientially inadequate. The removal lasted about 4 minutes, and for most of those 4 minutes Harry was gripping the bed rails with both hands while his chest did something that felt like a fist opening inside it, a clenching, releasing, clenching pressure that moved in waves, not quite painful but not the opposite of painful either. Like pins and needles but somewhere they had no business being. And when it was done, he wasn't prepared for it. He'd expected something like the first two. An incremental improvement. A slight increase in resolution. A door opening a fraction further. Instead it was as if someone had been playing music in a room next to his whole life, and the wall between had always been too thick to hear properly, and then the wall simply wasn't there. The world arrived with color. Not literally. But the emotional texture of the room, Ron's controlled fury, Hermione's frightened love, Snape's armored shame, Dumbledore's exhausted grief, McGonagall's righteousness, Aldrich's patient professional concern, it was all simply there, fully present, registering with a clarity that his whole life he'd been getting through gauze. He looked at Ron. Ron looked back at him. You all right? Ron said. Yeah, Harry said. His own voice surprised him, it had more in it than usual, some quality of presence in the register that hadn't been there before. Yeah, I think, he stopped, because what he thought was that he was going to need a minute with this particular feeling before he knew what to do with it, and he didn't have a minute because there were 37 more bindings and a headmaster to hold accountable and a war moving somewhere out beyond the castle walls. Take your time, Aldrich said. He was making notes. Harry breathed. Let the room settle into this new mode of being experienced. It was a lot. It was an enormous lot. He'd lived in a quiet room his whole life and now the room had walls that admitted sound. He looked at Dumbledore. He felt, for the first time fully and without the muffling of the dampener, what he actually felt about what Dumbledore had done. Not the managed, rational assessment of the morning. The actual, uninflected, unfiltered reality of it. It was not what he expected. He expected rage, he knew there was rage somewhere in there, he'd felt the edge of it this morning when he'd thought about 14 months old and someone standing over a baby with architectural intention. But the dominant note, arriving clearly now that one dampener had been removed, was something closer to sorrow. The particular grief of a person who realizes that someone they trusted built a version of them that was easier to trust. He let the sorrow be there. The identity anchors, he said, and his voice came out rougher than he expected, carrying the new emotional texture in its grain. You built them to make me believe I was supposed to be small. Dumbledore met his gaze. Yes. You built them so that even if the other bindings cracked or wore thin, my own perception of myself would maintain the suppression from the inside. Yes. That's not protection. Harry stopped. Started again. The core suppressants, the skill inhibitors, those are choices about my magic, even if they're wrong choices. But the identity anchors, he looked at the old man, steady and direct and without any overlay of deference or managed respect. Those are choices about me. About who I was supposed to believe I was. You didn't just limit what I could do. You shaped what I thought I was allowed to be. McGonagall's quill had stopped moving. Yes, Dumbledore said, for the third time. Each time he said it the word seemed to cost more. That is, an accurate description of what the anchors do. And what I intended them to do. Why, Hermione said, very quietly. Everyone looked at her. She was sitting forward in her chair, and her voice had the brittle quality of someone asking a question they've been holding back for a while. Why did it need to be that specific? You could have limited his magic without, why did you need to change how he thought about himself? Dumbledore looked at her for a long moment. Because magical capacity and self-belief reinforce each other. A mage who believes in their power will find ways around even robust suppression. The constructs on their own were not enough, not for a magical signature of Harry's magnitude. The only way to make the suppression hold reliably was to anchor it in Harry's own self-concept. To make the ceiling feel like the floor. So the room wouldn't feel like a room, Harry said. It would just feel like the world. Yes. Harry was quiet. I have one more question right now, he said. About the relationship trust complex. The memory construct that targeted specific individuals. He was watching Dumbledore's face with the new, undampened attention, tracking what moved and what didn't. Who was it targeting? Which relationships? Dumbledore's expression shifted. Not a lot. A person who hadn't been watching closely wouldn't have seen it. But Harry was watching closely, and what he saw was the first genuine moment of discomfort that had broken through the old man's composure, not guilt about the harm, but something more personal, a point of resistance. Healer Aldrich, Harry said, without looking away from Dumbledore. Can the memory complex be analyzed more specifically now that two more inhibitors are removed? Possibly, Aldrich said, picking up the disc. The architecture may be more legible with your own systems more active. He ran a quick scan. Made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Yes. I can see the targeting parameters more clearly now. He was quiet for a moment, reading. The complex targets, emotional memories of 3 individuals. The targeting is suppression adjacent rather than erasure, it doesn't remove the memories but it flattens the effect associated with them. Reduces the emotional significance. Makes the relationships feel less important than they were, Harry said. Less important than they are. Who, Harry said. The first 2 are clearly indicated, the targeting parameters include identifier markers. One is for your mother, Lily Evans Potter. The other is for, Aldrich paused. For Sirius Black. Harry's hands went still. Sirius, he said. Yes. Harry thought about Sirius. About the letters, the mirror he hadn't opened, the particular way he always felt when he thought about Padmore actions request aborted right the next chapter now. Shattered Chains Chapter 3, The Reckoning. The 4th removal happened at noon. Harry had asked Aldrich for a break after the Sirius revelation, not a long one, not the kind of break that was really avoidance wearing sensible shoes, just an hour to sit with what he'd learned before adding more to the pile. Aldrich agreed without commentary, which Harry was developing a genuine appreciation for. The man had a gift for knowing when silence was the most useful clinical tool available. He spent the hour by the window. Ron sat with him and didn't talk, which was exactly right. Hermione had gone to the library, not as avoidance, Harry thought, but because she processed pain by building structure around it, and the structure she was building right now was going to be thorough and heavily annotated and probably terrifying to whoever it was eventually aimed at. He'd watched her leave with her jaw set and her notebook under her arm and thought, good. Sirius. The memory construct had been flattening his emotional connection to Sirius, reducing the significance of the relationship, making those letters feel like obligations rather than lifelines, making the mirror feel like something he could put off opening because the urgency had been gently, surgically removed. He'd spent a year writing to his godfather in the careful measured way of a person who doesn't quite know what they feel, not understanding that the not quite knowing was constructed. That someone had built a wall between him and the person who was, by every reasonable measure, the closest thing he had to family. He thought about this by the window with Ron's solid, uncomplicated presence 3 feet to his left, and he felt the rage come in, not the clean edge of it from the morning, but something fuller now, heated by the restored emotional capacity, arriving with a weight that he sat with carefully and deliberately because he was not going to burn it off on the wrong target. There was a right target for this feeling and he was going to find it and he was going to be extremely precise about it when he did. At noon he told Aldrich he was ready for the 4th removal. The 4th removal was a core suppressant. The 1st and 2nd and 3rd had been peripheral, skill inhibitor, emotional dampener. The core suppressant was in a different category entirely, and Aldrich had warned him about this 3 times in 3 different ways, which Harry was reading as a healer's method of communicating. I want to be very clear that what happens next will be significant. Your core has been operating at approximately 35% of its natural capacity, Aldrich said, positioning the instruments with more care than usual. Removing one of the 5 suppressants will bring that to somewhere between 45 and 50%, depending on how your system redistributes. The physical response will be more pronounced than the previous removals. Pronounced how? Ron said, from his chair. The magical system will expand into the newly available space, Aldrich said. Think of it like a muscle that's been kept immobilized being asked to move again for the first time. There will be some discharge. Some involuntary output while the system reorients. Define involuntary output, Harry said. Aldrich looked at the window, which was still cracked open. Then at the lamp on the bedside table. Then at Harry. I'd recommend moving anything breakable out of the immediate vicinity. Ron stood up and moved his chair back about 6 feet. I'm doing it from the outer edge, Aldrich said, making a final adjustment to the disk's position. Slower release, more controllable. Don't fight the sensation, whatever you feel, let it move through rather than trying to contain it. Containment is the instinct, but it'll work against you here. Ready, Harry said. Aldrich worked. For about 30 seconds, nothing obvious happened. Then Harry felt it, deep, somewhere beneath the usual perception of his own body, in the place where magic lived that wasn't muscle or bone or thought, the foundational level of himself that he'd always been only dimly aware of. He felt something in that place that was enormous and compressed begin to uncurl. The window blew open. Not dramatically, not an explosion, not a crack of power. Just a sudden, decisive push outward, the way a breath pushes when you've been holding it too long, and the window responded, and the lamp on the bedside table flickered, and every curtain in the hospital wing moved simultaneously in a wave, and the diagnostic disc emitted a sound that was not in its usual operating register, a high, resonant note, like crystal struck with a finger. Harry sat in the middle of it and breathed. He felt enormous. Not in a self-aggrandizing way, not with any quality of ego attached to it, just in the raw physical sense of something that had been compressed expanding into its actual dimensions, and his actual dimensions were apparently considerably larger than the space he'd been living in for 15 years. His skin felt electric. The air felt different. He could feel the magic in the room, not just his own but the ambient magic of the castle, the deep old enchantments in the stone and the wood, and they recognized something in what he was carrying and responded to it the way a chord responds to its root note. It settled after about 2 minutes. Harry looked at his hands. They were completely steady. How do you feel? Aldrich said. Like I could move a building, Harry said. Don't, Aldrich said. Obviously, Harry said. Ron was watching him from the chair with an expression Harry couldn't entirely parse, some mixture of awe and relief and a fierce protectiveness that had always been Ron's primary mode when things went serious. You look different, Ron said. Different how? Like, Ron considered. Like when someone turns the lights up in a room. Same room. More light. Harry looked back at his hands. He turned one over, looked at the palm, felt the steady thrumming current of a magic that was still 30% suppressed and was already this, and thought about the other 4 core suppressants. Thought about what 30% felt like and what 100% might feel like and couldn't quite construct it. Couldn't build a model of himself that large from inside the current constraints. Not yet. Next session, he said to Aldrich. Tomorrow morning, Aldrich said firmly. Your system needs consolidation time. This isn't negotiable. Harry looked at him. This isn't negotiable, Aldrich repeated, with the pleasant, immovable quality of a man who has made firm medical decisions before and is experienced at being looked at by impatient patients. Tomorrow morning, Harry said. He was discharged from the hospital wing at 3 o'clock. Pomfrey had opinions about this. She expressed them in the clipped, efficient mode of a woman who knows she's losing an argument on technical grounds while remaining completely right on practical ones, but Aldrich's clinical position was that Harry's vitals were stable, the remaining constructs were not actively harmful in the way that would require inpatient monitoring, and the patient was, in his professional assessment, going to be considerably more comfortable and less likely to do something unilateral if he was allowed to return to some version of normal life between sessions. Define unilateral, Pomfrey said. Remove a binding himself, Aldrich said. Harry had not been planning to do that, but he noted the possibility with the reflexive attention of someone filing information that might be useful later. He walked out of the hospital wing into the corridor and the world was different. Not visibly. The stone was the same stone, the portraits were the same portraits, a few of them tracked him as he passed in the way they always did, and he tracked back with more attention than usual and caught the look that passed between a Tudor-era wizard and a painted cat in the corner of a hunting scene, a look of something like recognition, and filed that too. The corridor smelled like stone and old wood and the faint magical residue of 500 years of spellwork, and the smell had depth now, distinct notes he'd never separated before. Ron was on his left. Hermione had appeared from the direction of the library, her notebook visibly thick with new material, and taken his right. They walked in the close 3-person formation they'd been walking in since first year, and Harry felt, with the new undampened clarity of the removed emotional dampener, how much he loved them, not the word, which he'd always known, but the actual texture of it, the specific weight of having these 2 people alongside him. He'd been walking through his life with that weight muted for 5 years and hadn't known what he was missing. He thought about that and put it away for later, with everything else that was accumulating in the later folder, which was getting substantial. Okay, Hermione said, which was her way of starting a conversation that had been composing itself in her head for some time. I've been doing research. I know, Harry said. The binding statutes. Ministry law, specifically Statute 1847, and its amendments. Healer Aldrich mentioned it this morning and I wanted to understand the full scope. She opened the notebook while walking, which was a skill. Illegal magical binding of a minor's core is a Category 1 magical offense. Same bracket as unforgivable curses, actually. The distinction being that unforgivables are one-time acts and this is ongoing and premeditated. The statute allows for, Hermione. Harry stopped walking. She stopped too, and looked at him, and he held her gaze with the direct, present quality that was still getting used to being available to him. I'm not going to fudge, he said. She blinked. I wasn't necessarily suggesting, you were building toward suggesting it. I know your notebook. Her mouth did the small, pressed thing it did when he was right about something she'd been about to say. The ministry is the legal mechanism for Fudge spent last year telling anyone who'd listen that I was a liar and Voldemort hadn't come back, Harry said. Fudge and Dumbledore have a relationship that is, complicated in ways I don't fully know yet but intend to find out. The Ministry of Magic is not where this goes first. He started walking again. Not first. Where does it go first? Ron said. Harry was quiet for a moment. I want to see Sirius, he said. The fire in the Gryffindor common room was the standard method, and Harry used it after dinner, kneeling on the hearthrug with a handful of flu powder and the focused intention of someone who has decided that a thing is happening and is now simply executing. Sirius's face appeared in the flames within 2 minutes, which meant he'd been close to the fireplace. He spent a lot of time close to fireplaces, Harry knew, because Grimmauld Place was exactly as confining as its name suggested, and the fire was one of the few connection points that made the confinement bearable. Sirius looked the way he always looked, the handsomeness that 12 years in Azkaban had roughened into something more interesting, the dark eyes that were too quick and too alive for a man in permanent hiding. He looked at Harry through the flames and opened his mouth to say the usual greeting, the casual warmth that they'd built up over the year, and then he stopped. Harry, he said. Hi, Harry said. Sirius looked at him. Just looked at him, for a long, assessing moment, and something shifted in his expression that Harry, with the new clarity of the restored emotional capacity, read accurately for the first time as grief that had been performing as composure for a very long time. Something happened. Yeah. Harry sat back on his heels. Something happened. I need to tell you all of it, and I need you to not, I need you to hear it without going straight to what you want to do about it, because I've got thoughts about that and I want to get through the information first. Sirius was quiet for a moment. That's a very mature way to start a conversation. I have new perspectives, Harry said dryly. He told him. He was getting better at telling it. This was the third full recounting, after Ron and Hermione and the combined version for Pomfrey and McGonagall, and each time the story organized itself more cleanly, the shape of it becoming more navigable with the practice of telling. The 40 bindings. The categories. The names. The timeline from 14 months old through the reinforcement last summer. Sirius listened. He was extraordinarily still while Harry talked, which was unusual for Sirius, who was a person of physical expressiveness and restless energy. The stillness had the quality of a man exercising absolute control over himself, because the alternative was the kind of reaction that would end the conversation, and he promised, in the implicit way of a person who understood what was being asked, that he would hear it through. When Harry finished, the fire crackled. The relationship trust complex, Sirius said. His voice was level. A performance of level, but a good one. The one targeting your emotional connection to me. Yeah. How long has it been in place? Aldrich thinks since before 5th year. Maybe earlier. Harry looked at him. The letters felt different this year than 4th year. Less present. I thought it was because I was busy. Because I was stressed. I kept not opening the mirror. I know, Sirius said, very quietly. That wasn't me, Harry said. I need you to know that. Whatever version of the correspondence you've been reading, that muted, careful, slightly too formal version of me, that wasn't how I actually felt. That was what the complex left when it took what it suppressed. Sirius was quiet for a longer moment than usual. I knew something was off, he said eventually, the control in his voice going a shade rawer. I thought it was me. That I'd done something, or that the way things were between us was just, bounded by circumstances, by being in the order and in hiding and not being able to do anything useful for you. I thought the distance was, he stopped. I thought you were managing me. I thought I was fine, Harry said. That's worse, in a way. Yeah, Sirius said. Yeah, it is. They were quiet together across the fire. The complex comes off in the next few days, Harry said. With the memory constructs. Aldrich says the emotional connection should restore, not be rebuilt, but restore. The actual memories and feelings are still there, just blocked off. When the block comes down they come back. And in the meantime, Sirius said. In the meantime, I'm telling you, Harry said. This conversation is the beginning of what was always supposed to be there. Without the wall. Something moved across Sirius's face that was too complex to be a single emotion and too genuine to be managed. He looked at Harry through the green flames with the eyes of a man who has spent 12 years in a place designed to remove hope and has spent the years since learning, unsteadily, that hope was something he was still capable of. Okay, he said. What's the plan? I'm working on it, Harry said. Can I help? Yes, Harry said. But not yet. Not until I know more. I need a few more days of removals and then I'll know the full extent of what was done and then I'll know what needs to happen and in what order. Sirius nodded. And Dumbledore? Harry considered this. Dumbledore is complicated. Dumbledore is someone who bound a baby's magical core and called it mercy, Sirius said, and despite the level voice there was something in that sentence that carried the full weight of what Sirius thought without requiring additional expression. I know, Harry said. I haven't decided yet what I want to do about that. I want to hear the rest of his explanation first. That's more generous than I would be. I know, Harry said again. But I'm not doing this in anger. I'm doing it clearly, and anger isn't clear enough for this. A pause. Not yet anyway. Sirius made a sound that was adjacent to a laugh. You sound different. I feel different. You sound more like your father, actually. His voice caught on it, barely, covered quickly. James would've, he had this way of being furious that looked completely calm. Drove everyone mental. You couldn't tell he was about to do something devastating until he'd already done it. Harry was quiet, processing this small piece of information, this fragment of his father delivered casually through a fire call at 10 o'clock at night, and felt it land with the new fullness of an unblocked emotional register. It sat in his chest like a warmth that had been described to him his whole life and was now, finally, a temperature he could actually feel. Tell me more about that, he said. Not tonight necessarily. But, I want to hear about him. Both of them. The grief complex has been suppressing what their deaths meant to me since I was 2 years old and when it comes off I want to be ready for it. I want to already have more than I currently have. Sirius looked at him for a long moment. Yeah, he said, very gently. Yeah, Harry. I'll tell you everything. The next morning Harry went to Transfiguration. McGonagall had sent a note via Pomfrey suggesting that a return to routine might be clinically beneficial and also that she personally wanted to see how Harry was managing, which was McGonagall for I am looking out for you and choosing academic framing because it's more comfortable than the alternative. Harry appreciated both the looking out and the academic framing. He liked McGonagall's mode of care, it never asked him to perform gratitude or reassurance, just got on with being present. He walked into the classroom and 42 students looked at him. Because of course they did. Half the school had been in the Great Hall when he collapsed. The other half had heard about it within the hour. Hogwarts was a building-sized ecosystem of information distribution, and Harry Potter collapsing at breakfast and then vanishing into the hospital wing for a day and a half had been an event of considerable magnitude in that ecosystem. He sat down next to Ron and Hermione, put his bag on the desk, and looked at the board where the day's spell was written and waited for something to happen. What happened was, McGonagall came in, assessed the room's attention with one sweep of her sharp eyes, said, "Today we are working on multi-stage conjuration. Mr. Potter," she looked at him directly, with a deliberate quality, "please let me know if you need to step out at any point," and then proceeded to teach the class. The effect of this was that everyone who had been waiting to see if Harry Potter would be treated differently found that he was treated with professional courtesy and a practical acknowledgement of circumstances, and were thereby somewhat robbed of the drama they'd been anticipating, and the class got on with multi-stage conjuration. Harry conjured a goblet on his first attempt. He didn't mean to do it on the first attempt. The spell was a fifth-year skill. Technically, most students at this stage could manage a partial form, the ghost of a conjured object, with the full thing coming after 3 or 4 tries. Harry had always been average at transfiguration. Not poor, not brilliant, consistently somewhere in the reliable middle. A goblet on the first try was not the middle. He looked at it. Then he looked at it harder, feeling the slight structural imperfection on the left side of the stem, and without a word he adjusted it, a quiet thought, a push of precision through the wand, and the imperfection corrected. Ron, who had been watching, leaned over. "That was, I know," Harry said quietly. "How many more of these do you have to?" 36, Harry said. "This is from removing 3 peripheral ones and 1 core suppressant." Ron looked at the perfectly corrected goblet. Then at Harry. "Mate," he said, with the particular Ron Weasley quality of expressing enormous things in minimal words, "you were always better than this. Weren't you?" "Apparently," Harry said. From 3 seats over, Neville had conjured something that was approximately a goblet in the general vicinity of the correct dimensions and was examining it with cautious optimism. Across the room, Parvati and Lavender were working together and making good progress. Seamus had conjured what appeared to be a tankard, which wasn't quite right but showed excellent confidence about being wrong. Draco Malfoy, from the other side of the room, was watching Harry with an expression that was performing its usual studied contempt, and underneath it was doing something different. Calculating. Malfoy had always been, Harry thought, with fresh and undampened assessment, a person of genuine intelligence who spent a great deal of energy directing that intelligence at maintaining social hierarchy rather than anything more productive. He'd always made Harry feel assessed. Like a variable in a calculation. That feeling was still there, but it landed differently now, with the clarity of a system running closer to capacity. Harry met his eyes briefly. Malfoy looked away first. After class, as students filed out, McGonagall said, "Potter." A moment. The room emptied. Ron and Hermione waited just outside the door. Harry could hear them not quite clearly through the stone, existing in the loyal vicinity. McGonagall straightened the materials on her desk, and then she stopped straightening and simply looked at him. Without the professional frame. Just Minerva McGonagall, who had known him since he was a baby, who had sent Dumbledore a letter objecting to placing him with the Dursleys that very same night. He didn't know that yet, but he would, and the fact that she had written the letter was something that already lived in her face if you knew how to read it. "How are you?" she said. Not a teaching voice. Not even particularly her own voice. Something smaller and more genuine. "Better," he said. "Getting better." "The goblet," she said. "I know. Harry." She folded her hands on the desk. "What I witnessed in that hospital room yesterday, what Healer Aldrich presented, what Dumbledore confirmed," she stopped. Started again in the precise way of someone choosing every word. "I have taught at this school for 34 years. I have never, in 34 years, in 2 wars and more tragedy than I care to count, I have never been as ashamed of a decision made by someone I respect as I was sitting in that room." Harry looked at her. "I'm telling you this," she said, "not because it resolves anything or helps anything or is in any way about me. I'm telling you because you deserve to hear it from someone who should have been paying more attention." "I should have been paying more attention." "You didn't know," Harry said. "No. But I could have looked harder for what I didn't know." Her jaw was set in the way it always was when she was holding herself to a standard. "I intend to remedy that going forward." "I know," Harry said. "I know you do." She nodded, once, crisply. "I also want you to know that my notes from yesterday are complete and accurate and will be available to Healer Aldrich's Department of Magical Health report as supplementary witness documentation. That's also not about me, it's about building a record." "Thank you," Harry said. "Off you go," she said, in the teacher voice, which was her way of ending a conversation before it became more than she wanted to give away. He went. The owl arrived at lunch. Harry was sitting at the Gryffindor table eating properly for the first time in what felt like weeks, actually hungry, actually tasting it, the subdued grey quality of food having vanished along with the dampeners, when a ministry owl dropped a sealed envelope in front of him with the particular authority of official correspondence and left without waiting for a response. He looked at it. On the front, in the precise official font of ministry stationery, Harry James Potter, Gryffindor Tower, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Personal and confidential. Office of the Minister for Magic. Ron looked at it. Open it. Harry opened it. The letter was from Percy Weasley, which was not the same as being from Percy Weasley. It had the structure and phrasing of something Percy had been asked to write, the official warmth of a functionary performing sincerity. But the content was unmistakably Fudge's fingerprints. Dear Mr. Potter, it has come to the attention of the Office of the Minister that you have recently been subject to a medical evaluation at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry resulting in certain claims regarding your magical status. The Ministry wishes to assure you of its full support during what must be a confusing and distressing time. In the interest of your well-being and the well-being of the wizarding community, the Office of the Minister would like to arrange a meeting at your earliest convenience to discuss the findings of this evaluation and ensure that any information arising from it is managed appropriately. Please be aware that matters pertaining to the magical health and stability of a minor are, under Wizarding Welfare Act 1923, subject to ministry oversight and confidentiality obligations, and that any public dissemination of unverified medical claims may carry legal consequences. Harry read it through twice. Then he put it down and ate a forkful of shepherd's pie and chewed and swallowed. Hermione, reading over his shoulder, had gone very still. He's threatening you, she said. Managed appropriately. Legal consequences. He's trying to suppress the diagnostic findings. Yes, Harry said. Before they can go public. Yes. How does he even know already? Aldrich only, Dumbledore, Ron said flatly. He was reading the letter from across the table, right side up with the easy upside-down reading skill of someone who'd learned to read adult correspondence young. Dumbledore and Fudge have a whole thing. Dumbledore probably, maybe not told him directly. But someone in the school talked to someone at the ministry. Snape, Harry said. Ron and Hermione both looked at him. Snape reports to the ministry independently of Dumbledore, Harry said. He always has, it's part of his cover with Voldemort, he needs a ministry contact who can authorize his movements. I'd bet anything Fudge got a summary within hours. He was looking at the letter with the same expression he'd looked at the goblet with, focused, calibrating. He's scared. Fudge. He doesn't know what's in the full diagnostic report yet. He doesn't know all the names. But he knows enough to know that if this gets out properly, publicly, with documentation, it becomes a scandal the size of which makes Voldemort's return look manageable by comparison. Because Voldemort returning is scary, but Voldemort returning while the ministry's been complicit in suppressing the one person capable of fighting him, he picked up the letter, folded it precisely, put it in his pocket. That ends careers. Multiple ones. And Fudge knows his is in that pile. What are you going to do? Hermione asked. Harry picked up his fork again. Finish my lunch, he said. And then I'm going to visit Healer Aldrich. Aldrich listened to Harry's summary of the letter with his arms crossed and his expression running through what Harry had come to recognize as his working face, the focused processing look he wore when new information was being slotted into existing analysis. This is not unexpected, Aldrich said, when Harry finished. I know. The ministry has a history of attempting to manage medical findings that are politically inconvenient. The Welfare Act he's citing is, technically applicable, but the manner in which it's being invoked is a significant stretch of the original statute. He went to his desk. He'd been assigned a small office adjacent to the hospital wing, which he'd made efficient and Spartan within an hour of arrival, and opened a drawer. I submitted my preliminary report to the Department of Magical Health Services this morning, as required by law. That report is now in the system. The ministry cannot suppress or recall it without the explicit cooperation of the department head, who is, a slight pause, not a Fudge appointment and is unlikely to cooperate. So the findings are on record, Harry said. The preliminary findings. The full report will be submitted in 72 hours, when the analysis is complete. He looked at Harry. What I can also tell you is that medical reports of this nature, once submitted to the department, are accessible by the Wiesengemot under the Independent Evidence Statute. Fudge cannot block the Wiesengemot from seeing this. He can still try to discredit it, Harry said. Discredit me? Yes, Aldrich said. He can try that. Harry looked at the desk, at the diagnostic instruments arranged there, at the sequence journal with its 40 entries each representing something that had been done to him and was now being undone. I want to be ahead of this, he said. Not reacting. I want the story out before he can build the counter-narrative. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. That's not a clinical recommendation I can make, he said carefully. I know. I'm not asking for one. Harry looked at him. I'm asking whether the diagnostic documentation, the actual report, the instrument readings, the caster signatures, would be comprehensible to a journalist. Whether the evidence is self-explanatory. To a competent journalist with some magical health knowledge, yes. A pause. Completely comprehensible. Right, Harry said. I need a name. Aldrich looked at him for a long moment. Then he opened a different drawer, took out a small card, and handed it across. On it was a name Harry didn't recognize, M. Rourke, Independent Magical Correspondent, The Practitioner's Quarterly, and a contact address in Edinburgh. I was a source for a piece he wrote in 1998, Aldrich said, neutrally. On ministry interference in St. Mungo's diagnostic protocols. He is thorough, accurate, and independently funded, which means he cannot be pressured by advertising withdrawal. You're not recommending anything, Harry said. I'm not recommending anything, Aldrich agreed. Harry pocketed the card. Tomorrow morning. The next removal session. 8 o'clock, Aldrich said. Sleep. Your system needs the consolidation time. Harry left. The session the following morning ran for 3 hours. 3 removals, 2 emotional dampeners and a cognitive filter, because Aldrich had reviewed his sequencing overnight and determined that the interaction between these particular constructs meant they needed to come off together or the architectural gap would create an imbalance that would be uncomfortable to live in and more complicated to correct later. 3 simultaneous removals. The experience was, Harry would struggle to describe it afterward, when people asked more actions request aborted write the next chapter now. Shattered Chains Chapter 4, the declaration the letter to M. Rourke went out on a Wednesday. Harry wrote it himself, by hand, in the hospital wing during the 20-minute rest period Aldrich mandated between the morning removal session and whatever came next. He wrote it without showing Hermione first, which she found out about later and had opinions about, and without consulting Dumbledore, which was entirely the point. He kept it short, 3 paragraphs, the shape of a story rather than the story itself, enough to establish that what he had was real and documented and that he was choosing to speak and that he needed someone who knew how to listen. He sent it with his own owl, Hedwig, who had been visiting the hospital wing with the focused devotion of an animal that understands when her person is in difficulty and has decided the appropriate response is sustained presence. She took the letter with the dignified authority she brought to everything, and Harry watched her go out the window into the bright June morning and felt the specific satisfaction of a thing set in motion. Rourke will want to meet in person, Aldrich said, not looking up from the sequence journal. I know, Harry said. That means leaving the school. I know that too. Aldrich made a note. Said nothing further. Harry had come to appreciate this particular quality in him, the way he'd established very early that Harry was the decision-making authority on matters concerning Harry, and then simply stood by that principle without requiring repeated confirmation. Rourke's response arrived Friday morning. It was brief, professional, and yes. By Friday afternoon Harry had removed 13 bindings total. He was keeping count not obsessively but practically, the way you keep count of a long journey by landmarks rather than miles, not because the number was what mattered but because each removal came with something specific, a particular expansion or shift or unlocking, and tracking them helped him understand what he was becoming as he became it. The second core suppressant had come off Thursday. That one had been the most physically significant yet, more pronounced than the first, longer settling time, and the involuntary magical discharge had done something complicated to the candle sconces along the hospital wing wall that Pomfrey was quite reasonably annoyed about but hadn't actually complained about, which Harry thought was its own form of grace. His core was now running at approximately 60% of natural capacity. He could feel the difference in everything. Spells ran hotter and faster and with less effort. His awareness of magical structures around him had sharpened to the point where he could feel the individual enchantments layered into Hogwarts stone the way you feel the individual threads in cloth you're pressing your palm against. The castle felt alive in a way it never had before, or rather it had always been alive and he'd been unable to feel most of it. The cognitive filters coming off had been the strangest experience of all. Not painful, not physically dramatic. Just, suddenly, mid-session, mid-thought, finding that the thought was moving in 3 directions simultaneously and all 3 directions were yielding useful information. Pattern recognition, Aldrich had said. Strategic thinking. Harry had sat with it for an hour the first time it happened, just letting his mind run through everything it knew about his current situation from all the available angles, and what came out the other end was a strategic picture so clear and comprehensive that it alarmed him slightly. Not because it was dark but because he hadn't known he was capable of building it. He was capable of building it. He thought about 5 years of defense against the dark arts with the newly unfiltered clarity of someone who could now see what those 5 years should have looked like versus what they actually were. He thought about the DA, his students, the work they'd done together in the room of requirement, all those people he'd been teaching with a magic that was running at less than half its available capacity, teaching from behind a wall, and they'd still learn from him, which said something about them. He thought about what he could teach them now. He thought about what he could do now. Not with arrogance, there was no arrogance in it, arrogance being the attitude of a person who wants to be seen to be powerful, and Harry's relationship to what he was discovering about himself was something much more private and purposeful than that. He didn't want to be seen. He wanted to be useful. He wanted to take what had been systematically taken from him and use it for the thing it had apparently always been intended for, which was standing between the people he loved and the thing coming for them. He wanted, with a clarity he'd never had about it before, to finish this. The meeting with Rourke happened Saturday morning in Hogsmeade, at a table in the back corner of Madame Pudafoots, which Harry had chosen specifically because it was the last place anyone would think to look for him having a serious conversation. The decor was aggressively cheerful, lace and pink and small cherubs, the visual equivalent of a confectionery shop, and M. Rourke, who turned out to be a compact woman in her late 40s with the watchful eyes of someone who spent their professional life listening for what wasn't being said, sat among the cherubs with the absolute unfazed quality of a journalist who had conducted interviews in worse places. "Mara Rourke," she said, offering her hand. Her grip was firm and quick. "The Practitioner's Quarterly. You're younger than I expected." "People say that," Harry said. He was not in his school robes. He was in ordinary clothes, and he'd left his glasses on, the glasses that he'd been offered correction for twice and refused both times because some part of him, the suppressed part, had understood even then that the glasses were part of a version of him that the world expected and he wasn't ready to complicate that expectation. He was reconsidering the glasses. Among many other things. Ron was at a table near the door, doing an unconvincing impression of someone casually reading a Quidditch magazine. Hermione was outside, ostensibly browsing scriven shafts and actually maintaining a perimeter, which was a Hermione solution to security. Rourke set a quick quotes quill on the table and then, when Harry looked at it, put it away again. "I don't use those for anything I care about," she said. "Old-fashioned notes, if that's acceptable." "That's fine," Harry said. "Before you tell me anything," she folded her hands on the table. "I want to be clear about what I do. I write for the Practitioner's Quarterly, which is a small circulation independent publication focused on magical health, medical ethics, and related policy. My readership is roughly 6,000 subscribers, mostly healers, researchers, and health policy people. I'm not the Daily Prophet. I'm not Rita Skeeter. I don't do sensation. I do documentation. What I publish is accurate, sourced, and legally reviewed before it goes out. Good, Harry said. That's exactly what I want. 6,000 readers is not a mass platform, she said. 6,000 readers who are healers, researchers, and health policy people, Harry said. Half of whom are either on the Wisingamat, testify before it regularly, or have direct professional relationships with people who do. He met her eyes. The goal isn't maximum immediate reach. The goal is the right people reading the right documentation in a form that can't be dismissed as tabloid nonsense. Rourke looked at him for a moment with an expression that recalibrated somewhat from the one she'd walked in with. She picked up her notebook. All right, she said. Talk to me. Harry talked. He talked for an hour. He covered the diagnostic, the categories of bindings, the timeline, the caster signatures. He didn't name names in this first conversation, that was for the formal record to do, and the ministry letter and what it represented. Rourke listened with the focused, silent attention of someone for whom listening was a precision instrument, and she took notes in a quick, dense shorthand that Harry couldn't read but that seemed to capture everything given how rarely she asked him to repeat anything. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. You understand, she said, that if I publish this, it will become larger than my publication. Other outlets will pick it up. It won't stay in the quarterly. I know, Harry said. The Prophet will run a counter-narrative within 24 hours. Fudge will, I know what Fudge will do, Harry said. Which is why I want the documentation published in full. Not a summary. The full diagnostic report. Healer Aldrich has agreed to authorize its release as the attending clinician. The caster signature analysis. The timeline. Everything. Counter-narrative doesn't work against primary documentation. You can argue with a story. You can't argue with a clinical instrument reading and a list of 40 constructs cross-referenced to their casters. Rourke was writing. She stopped. You've thought about this carefully. I've had some new cognitive capacity come online recently, Harry said. I've been using it. She looked at him with the watchful journalist eyes, and then something in them shifted into something more human and less professional. How are you doing? Actually. He considered the question. Better every day, he said, which was true. Angrier every day, which was also true. Clearer about what comes next, which helps with the anger. He picked up his tea. I don't need you to write a human interest piece about how I'm feeling. I need you to write a piece about what was done and what the legal and ethical implications are. The human part is for me to deal with in private. Noted, Rourke said. But, he stopped. Thought about whether to say it and decided there was no reason not to, because this was the specific new quality of not having identity anchors making him feel small in his own thoughts. It matters that it was me, he said. Not because I'm famous or because of what I'm supposed to represent. But because if they did this to me, systematically, over 14 years, with the cooperation of the school and possibly elements of the ministry, then the question of who else has been managed this way, and how, and by whom, is a question that needs asking. Rourke looked at him. Yes, she said, and wrote something longer than usual. The article ran in the Practitioner's Quarterly the following Thursday, under the title 40 Illegal Constructs, a Clinical Report and Its Implications. It was 7 pages long, densely sourced, and included the complete diagnostic findings, Aldrich's signed clinical report, and 3 pages of analysis on the legal framework and what the statute violations implied for the individuals whose signatures appeared on the constructs. It did not name Dumbledore. It did not name Snape. It used clinical designations, Caster A, Caster B, Caster C, and indicated that the full names were in the sealed Department of Magical Health record that was available to the Wisingamat under the Independent Evidence Statute. This was Rourke's editorial decision, which she'd explained to Harry on Saturday. You don't need to name them in the article if the article makes clear that the names are in the legal record and that the legal record is accessible to the appropriate body. Naming them in the article gives the story the quality of attack. Not naming them gives the story the quality of process, which is more damaging because it's harder to dismiss. Harry had agreed with this logic immediately, which pleased him in the way that all correctly structured reasoning pleased him now that he could actually run it properly. The prophet picked it up on Friday morning. He knew it had happened before he even got to breakfast. He could feel it in the castle, not literally, not magically, just the particular quality of a building that houses 1,000 young people and has had a significant piece of information dropped into it. The breakfast noise was the wrong texture, too high-pitched and too full of pauses, the sound of several hundred conversations trying to talk about the same thing at slightly different levels of directly. He walked into the great hall and 800 people looked at him. He walked to the Gryffindor table, sat down, and served himself toast. "It's everywhere," Hermione said. She had 3 newspapers open in front of her, which required some architectural arrangement to manage. The Quarterly, the Prophet, they're running their counter-narrative, obviously, but it's badly organized because they didn't have lead time and they're clearly working off incomplete information. The Evening Prophet is doing a full feature. There are 2 different opinion pieces in the Wizarding wireless transcripts. And, she stopped. Dumbledore's office has been receiving owls since 7 this morning. I may have been watching the Ollery. Of course you were, Ron said. Someone at the Ministry has already issued a statement saying the diagnostic findings are under review, she continued. Which is their way of trying to establish that nothing is decided yet, that it's all still being assessed. But the Wisingamot receives petitions every Friday and today is Friday, so, today is Friday, Harry said. They looked at each other. I need to be somewhere else by this evening, Harry said, working through the timeline with the clean strategic clarity that was now available to him when he chose to use it. If the Wisingamot receives the petition today, Fudge has a weekend before the full session. He'll use that weekend to build opposition and manufacture a procedural block. I need to give him less room. How? Hermione said. By being in London before he expects it. Dumbledore will try to stop you leaving, Ron said. Dumbledore, Harry said carefully, is not going to stop me doing anything. Not anymore. The 3 of them sat with that for a moment. Not dramatically, it wasn't dramatic, it was simply a fact landing and being recognized as a fact. Right, Ron said. What do you need from us? He went to see Dumbledore first. Not because he needed permission, that framing was gone, thoroughly and permanently, but because Dumbledore deserved to hear it directly rather than find out when it was already in motion. Harry had thought about this and decided that dealing with Dumbledore fairly was something he could afford to do now, that fairness wasn't the same as deference and he wasn't confusing them. He knocked on the gargoyle, didn't wait for the password request, just said Fizzing Whizbee because he knew it from last year and hadn't been asked to forget, and went up. The office was the same as always. All the whirring instruments, the sleeping portraits, Fawkes on his perch looking at Harry with the liquid gold attention of a creature for whom time operates differently. The portraits were not sleeping today. Several of them were watching with the focused interest of people, paintings, who have been present for a great deal of history and recognize when more is being made. Dumbledore was at his desk. He had a copy of the Practitioner's Quarterly on the desk in front of him, open to the article. He looked up when Harry came in. Harry, he said. Good morning, Harry said. He didn't sit. Not rudely, just practically, he was passing through, not settling. I wanted to tell you before you hear it from someone else. I'm going to London today. I have an appointment at the Wisingamot offices this afternoon to submit a formal petition under the Independent Evidence Statute, so the full diagnostic report can be entered into the record before the session today. Dumbledore was quiet. The article has created enough public attention that someone needs to be there when the record is accessed, Harry continued. Someone who can answer questions and provide the accompanying witness documentation. Healer Aldrich will be there. Professor McGonagall has agreed to provide her witness statement. Madame Pomfrey as well. Harry. Dumbledore's voice was quiet. Not authoritative, not the managed warmth. Something more genuine and less comfortable. What you're doing, I want you to understand that the consequence of this process, if it proceeds as you intend, will be, I know what the consequences will be, Harry said. I've thought about them carefully. I know that your reputation will be damaged. I know that Snape's position becomes precarious, which is complicated by the fact that he's a double agent and his position actually matters to the war effort. I know that Fudge will use every procedural tool available to make this difficult, and that some of them will temporarily work. He looked at the old man steadily. I know all of that. I'm going anyway. I wasn't going to ask you not to, Dumbledore said. Harry paused. Dumbledore looked at the quarterly, at the article he'd been reading when Harry came in. I was going to say that the consequences will include things being significantly better. For you. For the war effort. For a great many people who have been living in the long shadow of managed information for a very long time. A pause. I've been sitting here this morning thinking about what it means that a 15-year-old boy had to arrange this himself. That it required him to collapse in a breakfast hall and a healer with enough professional integrity to run a full diagnostic rather than a surface check before any of this came to light. His hands were very still on the desk. That's not wisdom. That's the compounding failure of someone who convinced himself that management was the same as protection. Harry looked at him. He felt, with the clarity of 7 removed bindings and a restoring emotional register, the complexity of what he felt about Albus Dumbledore. Not simple rage, not forgiveness, not the muted trust of the years before. Something that held all of those without resolving into any of them. The feeling of being held in someone's estimation so highly that they'd made you smaller to protect you, which was a form of love so wrong-headed it had done years of damage, and was still love, which made it harder and not easier. He didn't say any of this. I'll be back by dinner, he said. Healer Aldrich wants the removal sessions to continue Monday. Harry. Dumbledore's voice stopped him at the door. He turned. I'd like, when this is concluded. Whatever form the conclusion takes. I'd like the opportunity to answer any questions you have. All of them. Without management. Harry looked at him. We'll see, he said. Not yes. Not no. The honest answer, which was that he didn't yet know what he wanted from Dumbledore once this was done, and he wasn't going to promise anything he wasn't sure of. He went. London was London, cold logic and stone and the thrumming undercurrent of a city moving at full speed, and the Ministry of Magic was the Ministry of Magic, which meant pompous atrium and irritating security and the particular brand of bureaucratic grandeur that worked very well for making people feel small and unimportant. Harry walked through the atrium with Healer Aldrich on his left and McGonagall on his right, and people looked, of course they looked. The article had been out for barely 24 hours and the world was already rearranging its understanding of him, and he walked through the looking without adjusting his pace or expression. He was dressed plainly. He hadn't done anything with his hair. He was wearing the glasses. Not because of the glasses as disguise logic that the identity anchors had apparently been reinforcing, but because he genuinely hadn't gotten around to sorting his vision and it wasn't a priority right now. He looked like a 15-year-old in ordinary clothes walking through the Ministry of Magic with a qualified healer and a Hogwarts professor, which was a slightly unusual sight, but the lack of performance in it, the complete absence of any attempt to look significant or produce an impression, had a quality that was somehow more commanding than performance would have been. He felt people adjust around him. Not to celebrity. To something more specific, harder to name. The adjustment of people encountering someone who is entirely present in a space without needing the space to confirm their presence. The Wisengamot offices were on level 2. Madame Griselda Marchbanks, who administered the independent evidence statute petitions among approximately 1,000 other things, and who was 83 years old and possessed of the examinational certainty of someone who had sat the OWL test of enough generations to have seen exactly what human beings were capable of and was no longer surprised by it, received them in a small, precise office crowded with filing cabinets and the accumulated paperwork of decades. She looked at Harry over her glasses. "Mr. Potter," she said. "I examined your grandfather's charms OWL. He was exceptional. Sit down. Harry sat. The petition process took 45 minutes, which was faster than Aldrich had expected and Harry had planned for. Marchbanks was efficient in the way of a person who has done something 10,000 times and has eliminated every unnecessary step. She reviewed the diagnostic report, cross-referenced the statutory violation categories, established the chain of evidence from Aldrich's submission to the department, and entered the full documentation into the Wisengamot record with the same focused precision she'd brought to grading OWL papers 40 years ago. The session today will acknowledge receipt, she said, closing the final folder. The full hearing will be scheduled within 10 days. Given the statutory violation categories involved, attendance will be mandatory for the named parties, the designations will be lifted from the medical record and the full names entered into the hearing notice. She looked at Harry. You will likely be called as a witness. I know, Harry said. You will be questioned by members who are not sympathetic to your position, she added, with the direct quality of a woman who found cushioning the facts an inefficient use of time. I know that too, Harry said. She looked at him over her glasses again, with the particular focused assessment of someone who has been reading people from examination papers for the better part of a century. You seem quite prepared for a 15-year-old. I've had some obstacles removed recently, Harry said. She made a sound that might, in a more expressive person, have been a laugh. Indeed. She stood, indicating the meeting was complete. The record is entered. The petition is lodged. You'll receive formal notification of the hearing date by Ministry Owl within 48 hours. She looked at Aldrich. The clinical report is exceptional work, Healer. That level of documentation is not commonly seen. The evidence was substantial, Aldrich said simply. Fudge was waiting in the atrium. Not literally, he wasn't standing there in official robes with a welcoming committee, he was doing the thing powerful people did when they wanted an encounter to appear accidental, which was position himself in a place he was plausibly meant to be and let the encounter unfold as if by coincidence. He was talking to someone near the fountain, too casually, in the particular way of a man whose posture says I've been here for a while and whose eyes say I've been watching the level 2 lift for 20 minutes. He turned when Harry, Aldrich, and McGonagall stepped out. Harry. The tone was warmth and concern and the particular brand of political friendliness that Harry's pattern recognition faculty, running sharp and clear now, identified in about half a second as a performance with 3 distinct goals: make Harry feel managed, create witnesses to a positive interaction, and establish Fudge as a benevolent authority figure before any version of today's events got reported. Harry stopped. Fudge came across the atrium with his hand extended, his lime green bowler hat, an astonishing choice that Harry had always found somehow more alarming than anything else about him, set at its usual angle, his round face arranged in the expression of a minister who cares deeply. Harry shook his hand. Cornelius, he said. It wasn't intended to be unsettling, but the use of the first name, delivered without heat or edge, just as a simple fact of address, the natural mode of a person who does not currently feel required to perform deference to a title, did something to Fudge's expression. A small recalibration, quickly covered. I was hoping we'd have the chance to talk, Fudge said. I received the news this morning about this whole business with the diagnostic. He gestured vaguely, the gesture of someone trying to make something large seem small. Terrible thing. Naturally the ministry wants to ensure the petition is lodged, Harry said. The full documentation is in the Wisengamot record. The hearing is scheduled within 10 days. He said it pleasantly, the same way he'd have said the weather looks nice, factual, easy, unloaded. I wanted to make sure you had the timeline directly from me, so there's no confusion about the state of the process. Fudge's pleasant expression did not waver, because he had been a politician for long enough that his pleasant expression was structural and survived significant internal weather. But something behind it shifted. Of course. I think it's important to manage this carefully, I think it's important to be accurate, Harry said. The documentation is accurate. The process is established. It'll proceed. He looked at Fudge with the clear, uncomplicated attention of someone who is not performing confrontation but is also not pretending things are other than they are. The letter your office sent me last week mentioned legal consequences for public dissemination of unverified claims. I want to be clear that the claims are fully verified, clinically documented, legally submitted, and now on the Wisengamot record. So that particular concern should be resolved. Fudge was quiet for exactly one beat too long. Naturally, he said. I'm glad it's all moving through the proper channels. It is, Harry agreed. He moved to go. Fudge, apparently finding that he wasn't done, said, Harry, I hope you understand that whatever happened in the past, the Ministry has always had your best interests. Cornelius, Harry said, pausing without turning fully back, I'm 15 years old and I've had 40 illegal magical constructs removed from my core in the last week. I think we're both a bit past the point where that particular framing is going to work. He walked out of the atrium without hurrying. Behind him, he heard McGonagall make the sound she made when something had been done exactly right and she was declining to say so out loud. Voldemort moved on Sunday. Harry felt it before he heard about it, woke at 3 a.m. with the scar burning in a way it hadn't burned all week, hot and precise like a brand, and lay in the dark of the hospital wing. Aldrich had asked him to stay close during the intensive removal period, with his hand pressed to his forehead and his mind doing something it had never done before with the scar connection. Usually the pain was just pain. Just the raw signal of proximity, of the connection being activated, Voldemort's emotions bleeding through in flashes of image and feeling that Harry had always received passively, helplessly, the way a radio receives a signal it can't block. But with the cognitive filters coming off and the core suppressant sitting at 60% and the natural magical capacity pushing through the remaining gaps, the signal was coming through differently. Not just received. Readable. He could feel Voldemort's mind against the connection like a hand pressed against the other side of glass. He could feel the shift in it, a recalculation, or revision of a previous position, the specific emotional texture of someone who has received information that has changed their operational picture. Intelligence, Harry recognized. Real, genuine strategic intelligence. He was receiving Voldemort's intelligence and for the first time he could read the shape of it. He's seen the article. Not the thought clearly, not words. But the emotional architecture of it, a mind that had planned for a particular version of an opponent and has just learned that version was inaccurate, a mind that is now revising with the focused efficiency of a very capable strategist. Harry sat up in bed and thought. He thought for about 20 minutes with everything available to him. Then he got up, went to Aldrich's door, knocked twice. Aldrich opened it in 30 seconds, fully dressed, which indicated he'd been awake, which meant his own awareness of risk was running on a parallel track to Harry's. He's moving, Harry said. Where? I don't know yet. But the attack isn't the point, it's a message. He knows the diagnostic story is out. He knows I've been accessing more of my capacity. He wants to make a statement before the hearing reframes the narrative. Harry was thinking while talking, the pattern recognition faculty running connections at a speed he was still getting used to. He'll hit somewhere visible. Somewhere symbolic. He wants the story to shift from Harry Potter was magically suppressed to Harry Potter still can't stop Voldemort. Which means he'll choose a target where he expects you to respond. Which means he's choosing the target based on what he thinks will draw me, Harry said. Which means he's not hitting a random location. He's hitting somewhere I care about. They looked at each other. Hogsmeade, Harry said, with the clean certainty of a completed calculation. It's the closest wizarding location to the school, it's full of civilians, it's a symbolic attack on the school community without crossing the wards, and he knows he was already moving toward the window, wand in hand. The wards on the school don't extend to, Aldrich began. I know. Harry turned back. Send for Dumbledore. And Aurors if you can reach them faster. But I'm not waiting. Potter, I know what I'm doing, Harry said, simply and without heat, and went through the window. The Hogwarts grounds at 3 in the morning were silver and cold, the castle rising behind him solid and eternal in the moonlight, the path to Hogsmeade cutting through the dark in the familiar direction. He ran it, not because he couldn't have managed something faster, but because moving physically through space while moving strategically through a problem worked better than standing still, and by the time he reached the edge of Hogsmeade he knew 3 things: where the attack would be centered, how many Death Eaters were likely, and what he was going to do about it. The first sign was the green fire. Not fiend fire, that was a different quality of magical signature, one he could now feel as distinct, a cold malice to it rather than the hot chaos of the fiend fire he'd encountered in nightmares and flashes of other people's memories. This was curses. Multiple casters, 5 or 6, attacking in coordinated bursts, targeting the buildings on the high street. He came around the corner and the scene was immediately readable. 6 Death Eaters in a loose formation, working in 2 teams of 3. One team maintaining suppressive fire on the 3 broomsticks, where a handful of people had been hit or were sheltering. The second team moving systematically through the storefronts, not looting, not random, staging. Setting up a visual. Making it look catastrophic. Message, Harry thought again. All of this is message. He stopped at the corner and looked at the scene and felt, not fear. Something cleaner and colder than fear. The specific emotional state of a person who has prepared for something, is ready for it, and is now simply executing. He stepped out. "Oi," he said. Not a battle cry. Not a speech. Just the word, conversational, in the tone of someone who has entered a situation and would like its participants to be aware of that fact. 3 of the Death Eaters turned toward him. He hit all 3 simultaneously. Not the same spell, that would have been elegant, but there was no need for elegance, there was need for efficiency, and efficiency meant the right tool for each target. The first was a stunning hex, fast and precise, before the man had finished turning. The second was a disarming charm that he didn't actually need the wand for, he felt that with a slight shock, the wandless casting happening with a naturalness that wasn't effortless but was possible in a way it had never been before, the wand in his hand as a focusing tool rather than a necessary channel. The third was a binding hex so tight it put the man on the ground before he had time to process the previous 2 had gone down. 3 seconds. 3 targets. The other 3 had processed what happened and were moving, 2 toward him, 1 breaking for a position with better line of sight. Harry tracked the one breaking for position first because that was the tactical priority, hit him with a reductor aimed at the ground in front of him rather than at him, the force enough to send him sprawling. The 2 coming at him were firing. He deflected both, not with a shield, with a redirection charm, which sent both curses into the wall of gladrags at angles that did architectural damage but harmed no one. Stepped inside one man's casting range, which put him too close for effective wand work, and used that fact, a straightforward physical disarming, wand wrist controlled, wand gone, man on the ground. The 6th Death Eater had gotten to his feet and was firing from 20 yards. Harry raised a shield, Protego Maxima, full strength, and the shield that came up was nothing like the thin thing Hermione had watched him cast 2 weeks ago. It was massive and solid and brighter than it had any need to be, the kind of shield that doesn't just stop a spell but states a fact about the person generating it, and the spell hit it and scattered into nothing. Harry looked at the 6th Death Eater over the top of it. The man stopped firing. He was looking at the shield. At Harry. At the 5 figures on the ground behind Harry. At the shield again. "There are going to be Aurors here in about 8 minutes, Harry said, lowering the shield because it was no longer necessary. "You can wait for them here," or, he left the or unfinished, because the 6th Death Eater was already moving, backing up, and then turning and running, and Harry let him go because stopping him wasn't worth the effort and the man was going back to Voldemort with information Harry was content for Voldemort to have. This is what Harry Potter is now. He looked around the street. The 3 Broomsticks door was opening, Madame Rosmerta, with the controlled terrified fury of a woman who has seen her building attacked and is now in the aftermath of the terror, looking at the scene with rapidly working out what happened eyes. 3 people behind her, unhurt. Further down the street, movement, people who'd been sheltering checking the silence. Harry walked toward the 3 broomsticks, wand in hand, 5 bound Death Eaters on the street behind him. "Is everyone all right?" he said. Madame Rosmerta looked at him. At the street. At him. "Potter," she said, in a voice that held several things at once. "That was, you were, is everyone all right?" he said again. "Yes," she said. "Yes, yes." "Good." He looked at the bindings on the 5 Death Eaters, checked they were holding, and turned to face down the street as the first Aurors, 3 of them, responding to the alert that Aldrich had sent, came running in from the Hogsmeade apparition point. The senior Auror, a woman Harry recognized as Kingsley Shacklebolt's partner, came in fast and stopped, taking in the scene. Her eyes went to the 5 bound figures. Then to Harry. Then to the figures again. 5 secured, she said. 5 secured, Harry confirmed. 6th ran, he'll report back. You'll want to get these processed before anyone tries a recovery. He looked at the buildings. The 3 broomsticks has some structural damage on the east wall. Everyone inside is uninjured. She was still looking at him with the expression of someone updating their file on a subject in real time. How long ago did this start? She said. When I got here, about 4 minutes. They'd been here maybe 2 minutes before that. He paused. It was staged. They were building a visual, not running an extraction or looking for anything specific. The intent was damage for display. How do you, the positioning, the target selection, the spell pattern. Suppressive fire on the civilians, cosmetic damage to the buildings. Nobody was dead or they'd have made sure someone was dead. He looked at her steadily. It was a message. Time to the article. She looked at him for a long moment. Who sent you? She said. Nobody, he said. Another moment. Right, she said, and got to work. Dumbledore arrived 15 minutes later, with Snape 3 steps behind him. Harry was sitting on the steps of the 3 broomsticks, watching the Aurors process the scene, and he felt both of them approach rather than saw them. That ambient magical awareness was becoming more natural, less something he noticed and more something he simply used. Dumbledore stopped beside him. Looked at the 5 secured Death Eaters. At the damage. At Harry. Are you hurt? He said. No, Harry said. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. I felt the binding hexes from the school, he said. The force of them. A pause, weighted with something Harry couldn't fully read yet through the remaining bindings. I didn't recognize the signature immediately. You will eventually, Harry said. Snape made a sound. Harry looked at him. Snape was standing 2 steps back from Dumbledore, and his face was doing the complicated thing it did when he was running an internal calculation that produced a result he didn't want but couldn't argue with. He was looking at the scene with the particular attention of a man who has spent his adult life around dark magic and is very good at reading it, and he was reading what Harry had done and what that meant about what Harry was. Professor Snape, Harry said. Snape's eyes moved to him. The usual contempt was absent, which in its absence revealed the complicated substrate underneath, the intellectual honesty of a man who respects competence even when he has complicated feelings about the person demonstrating it. Efficient, Snape said. Not warmth. But not contempt either. Something more like a clinical observation from a person whose standards were high enough that it meant something to meet them. One at a time would have been slower, Harry said. Yes, Snape said. They looked at each other across the particular gulf of their history, which had just changed shape, and neither of them pretended it hadn't. Harry stood up. Looked down the street at the Hogsmeade buildings in the grey pre-dawn, at the damage that was real and significant and would need repair, at the people moving carefully back into the street now that the Aurors had the scene. Message delivered, he thought. Both ways. He could feel, through the connection, faint now, the scar cooling as distance or distraction moved Voldemort's mind elsewhere, the recalibration on the other end. A mind that had sent 6 people to make a statement and had gotten 5 of them handed back bound and a statement of a different kind in return. Voldemort had expected the suppressed version. The managed boy. The version that had been carefully constructed by years of effort. He was going to need a new picture. Harry started walking back toward the school. Chapter 5, The Settlement. The last binding came off on a Tuesday. Aldrich removed it at 8 in the morning with the same methodical precision he'd brought to the first 39, and it was, structurally speaking, the smallest construct on the list, one of the identity anchors, the third and final one, a delicate thing compared to the core suppressants and the memory complexes, architecturally elegant in the way that the most insidious things often were. It had been left for last deliberately. Aldrich's sequencing logic was that removing the identity anchors before the cognitive and emotional systems were fully restored would be like demolishing a load-bearing wall in a house that was still being rebuilt around it. You needed the structure sufficiently established before you took away the thing that had been defining the shape of it. So it was last. Harry sat in the hospital wing in the morning light, which was coming through the windows at the particular June angle that made everything gold, and Aldrich pressed 2 fingers to the disc and spoke the removal phrase, and Harry felt himself arrive. Not dramatically. Not with a thunderclap or a flood of sudden sensation. It was quieter than that, more complete, the difference between a photograph and the actual place. Everything that had been restoring over the past 10 days, the magic, the cognition, the emotions, the memories still finding their way back through the cleared channels, settled into alignment, and what settled was simply him. The actual dimensions of a person who had been living in a constructed smallness for 15 years and was now, for the first time, the full size of himself. He sat with it for a moment. Aldrich was watching him with the professional attention of a man waiting for a clinical indicator, and what he saw after about 30 seconds made him write something in the sequence journal and then close it, which was as close to ceremony as Aldrich got. "How do you feel?" he said. Harry thought about the question properly, which was new, not the reflexive fine that had served as the answer for 15 years, but the actual considered response of a person taking genuine stock. "Like myself," he said. "For the first time." Aldrich nodded. "The memory complexes will continue restoring over the next few weeks, the blocked material comes back gradually, not all at once, which is easier to manage. The emotional recalibration will also take time. Your system has adapted to operating within constraints for so long that operating without them will feel strange in some ways before it feels natural." "I know," Harry said. "The magical output is going to require some controlled practice. At full capacity without established discipline is, I'll be careful," Harry said. Aldrich looked at him with the expression of a man who has been saying be careful to patients for 20 years and has a statistically informed relationship with how often that advice is taken. "Carefully," Harry said, with the slight shift in tone that meant, "I mean it." "The removal process is complete," Aldrich said. He set the diagnostic disc on the desk with a finality that was also a kind of ceremony, the weight of an instrument that had done significant work being set down. "I'll do a follow-up scan in 2 weeks to confirm structural stability. Otherwise," he paused. "Otherwise, you're done here." Harry stood up. He was aware of his own physicality in a different way than usual, more grounded, more solid, the feeling of being fully present in a body that was now running the way it was built to run. He picked up his wand from the bedside table. Felt the connection through it, the full connection, nothing filtered, nothing gated, the phoenix feather core resonating at a register it had apparently been trying to reach for 5 years and could now finally access. He looked at the diagnostic disc one more time. 40 constructs. 40 removals. 10 days. He put his wand in his pocket and walked out of the hospital wing into the corridor, and the castle met him, all its deep old magic recognizing what he was carrying in a way that made the stone seem to hum very faintly, very quietly, in the way of something ancient acknowledging something it has been waiting for. He had a Wisengamot hearing in 4 days. He had a war to finish. He had a great deal to do, and for the first time in his life he had all of himself to do it with. He went to find his friends. Ron and Hermione were in the common room, which they'd been in since 6:30 according to the hot chocolate situation on the table between them, Ron's half-finished and going cold, Hermione's untouched because she'd been reading and forgotten it existed, which was her standard operating mode. They both looked up when he came through the portrait hole. Ron assessed him in the quick comprehensive way he'd been doing since the first removal, taking in whatever quality of presence Harry was currently emitting and calibrating against the previous version. He'd been doing it every day, tracking the gradual shift, the incremental arrivals. Today his face did something different. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. "Last one," he said. "Last one," Harry said. Ron nodded, slowly. Then he picked up his cold hot chocolate, took a sip of it with the resigned acceptance of a person who has been so absorbed in waiting for something that he forgot about the drink in his hand, and said, "Good." Just that. Not "are you okay" or "how do you feel" or the other forms of the question that required Harry to perform reassurance. Just, "Good." As in, this is the right outcome, the required thing has occurred, we can move forward now. Harry sat down in the armchair across from them and felt the familiar architecture of this space, the Gryffindor common room, the fire, the slightly battered furniture, the red and gold that had been his visual vocabulary for home for 5 years, settle around him with a new quality of warmth. The emotional dampeners being gone meant the warmth was actually warm rather than the muted awareness of warmth he'd always had, like knowing a fire was lit in the next room versus sitting directly in front of it. Hermione closed her book with one finger marking the page, which meant she wanted to be able to go back to it but was acknowledging that the current moment had priority. "The hearing is Friday," she said. "I know. I've been preparing documentation. A supplementary analysis of the statutory violations, cross-reference to precedent cases. There aren't many directly analogous precedents, which is itself significant because it means the Wisengamot will be working with first principle law rather than established pattern. That can go either way." She said this with the particular intensity of someone who has been sitting with information for days and needs to deliver it to its intended recipient. Marchbanks is on the full session panel. She's not Fudge's appointment and she was Dumbledore's contemporary at school, which is complicated but probably nets out as someone who understands exactly what the stakes are and won't pretend otherwise. "Good," Harry said. "Fudge has been, maneuvering," she continued, in the tone of someone describing something deeply irritating with great precision. "He's filed 2 procedural motions to delay. Both were rejected by the clerk's office, which suggests someone in the procedural chain is not playing along. He's also been briefing against the article. I've seen 3 pieces in the Prophet describing the Practitioner's Quarterly as a fringe publication and suggesting the diagnostic methodology is contested, which it isn't, and he knows it isn't, but the goal is to muddy the water enough that the average witch and wizard doesn't know what to believe," Harry said. "Exactly. It won't work," Ron said. "The average witch and wizard has been reading about Harry for 15 years and whatever else they think about him, they don't think he makes things up. The Prophet spent a year calling him a liar last year and nobody actually believed it. They performed believing it." He said this with the confidence of someone who grew up in a wizarding family and understands its social dynamics from the inside in a way Harry and Hermione, for different reasons, don't. People were waiting for a reason to stop performing. "This is it." Harry looked at him. "What?" Ron said. "You're right," Harry said. "I know I'm right. Don't sound so surprised." "I'm not surprised. Harry thought about how to say it. The new emotional register had given him access to things he'd always felt but never been able to articulate clearly, and this was one of them, the specific gratitude for Ron's particular brand of intelligence, which was entirely different from Hermione's and entirely different from Harry's own and constituted something that neither of them had alone. "I'm glad you're here," he said. Ron looked at him for a moment with the slightly self-conscious quality he got when directness landed differently than expected. "Yeah, well," he said. "Obviously. He found Snape in the dungeons at 3 o'clock. This was entirely his own initiative. Snape had not requested the meeting, Dumbledore had not arranged it, and neither Ron nor Hermione knew he was going. He'd thought about it carefully, running the question through every cognitive faculty he now had clean access to, and the answer that came back was the same each time. There was a conversation that needed to happen before Friday, and it needed to happen without mediation. He knocked on the office door. Enter. Snape was at his desk, marking essays with the focused dissatisfaction he brought to student work that didn't meet his standards, which included the work of every student he'd ever taught because his standards were genuinely high even if his methods of communicating disappointment were consistently counterproductive. He looked up when Harry came in. His expression cycled through several things before settling on a controlled neutrality that was, Harry recognized, the post-revelation version of the old contempt. The contempt had been easy, performed, a tool. This neutrality was harder work. "Potter," he said. "Professor," Harry said. He sat down in the chair across the desk without being invited, which Snape noticed and said nothing about. "I want to talk about the emotional dampeners." Snape set down his quill. 11 constructs, he said, flatly. "Placed at the direction of, I know who directed it," Harry said. "I'm not here about the direction. I'm here about the fact that you placed them." He looked at Snape steadily. 11 emotional dampeners. Over 4 years. The most recent one in the summer after my 4th year, when I'd just come back from the graveyard. Something moved in Snape's face. "That one specifically," Harry said. "I want to understand that one. Because the logic for the others, I've heard Dumbledore's logic, and I disagree with it, but I can reconstruct it. The logic for a new dampener immediately after I watched Cedric die and Voldemort come back in a body," he stopped. "Let the absence of words do the work. That one I can't reconstruct." Snape was looking at the desk. Not avoiding, processing. Doing the internal thing he did where he ran something through every analytical filter available before speaking, the way some people go quiet before they say something they mean. "You came back from the graveyard," Snape said, in a state of acute magical distress. The grief and the trauma and the shock had created a pattern of magical discharge that the headmaster assessed as visible. Too visible. The Dark Lord's intelligence was going to see that I was traumatized, Harry said. Snape looked up. "Which is human," Harry said. "Which is what anyone would be. You put a dampener on me the summer after the worst night of my life because the evidence that it was the worst night of my life was too visible." A pause. "I sat in Dumbledore's office that night. The spinning instruments. He sent me away because he said he couldn't speak to me. I couldn't cry. Not properly. Not the way it should have." He stopped himself. "The dampener was already in place by then, wasn't it?" Snape was very still. "When in the sequence of that evening," Harry said. "Did you, at the hospital wing," Snape said. Quiet. The voice stripped entirely of performance. "While you were being treated. Before you went to the headmaster's office." He looked at Harry with an expression that was, for the first time Harry could remember, simply a face, all the armor off, the complicated man underneath visible and not trying to be invisible. "I told myself it was protective. That the rawness of it would draw attention. That a grieving boy was a liability. To Dumbledore's plan," Harry said. "To your survival," Snape said, and for a moment Harry could see that Snape believed this, actually believed it, that the line between Dumbledore's plan and Harry's survival had been so thoroughly merged in Snape's thinking that distinguishing them felt like splitting a self in half. "I told myself, you told yourself a lot of things," Harry said. "I'm not going to tell you whether they were right or wrong, because I think you already know. What I want to know is," he looked at the man across the desk. The man who had taught him for 5 years with something that had always felt like targeted hatred and was now revealed as something much more complicated and less comfortable. "Did any part of you know that you were taking something from me? Not protecting me. Taking something." A long silence. "Yes," Snape said. The word was very small for the weight it carried. "Okay," Harry said. He sat there for a moment with that, with the complexity of a person who has done genuine harm and knows it and is sitting with that knowledge without deflecting or justifying, which was more than Harry had expected and which changed the shape of what he felt about Snape without resolving it. "The hearing is Friday," Harry said. "Your name is in the clinical record. The Wizengamot will know what you placed and when. I don't know what they'll decide to do with that information." He looked at Snape directly. "I'm also aware that you're a double agent whose value to the war effort is directly connected to your continued position here and your continued relationship to Voldemort. I haven't asked for any specific outcome at the hearing. I've submitted the clinical record and let the process work." Snape looked at him. "You could have requested, 'I'm not running it,'" Harry said. "I'm not trying to orchestrate the outcome. I laid out what happened and I let the appropriate body decide what it means." He paused. "Whether that's generous or strategically neutral, I'll let you work out." Snape studied him for a long moment with the evaluating intelligence that had always been there under everything else. "Your father," he said, "would have tried to orchestrate the outcome." "I'm not my father," Harry said. "No," Snape said, and the word had in it something that was not quite an apology for the years of just like your father and not quite an admission but was in the neighborhood of both. "No. You're not." Harry stood. "I'll see you at the hearing." He left. In the corridor outside, he stood for a moment and breathed, let the conversation settle, the complexity of it, the strange grief of learning that the people who hurt you most were often the ones who believed most completely that they were helping. He didn't have a clean feeling about Snape. He suspected he wouldn't for a long time. But the conversation had done what he'd needed it to do. It had been real, unmediated, two people in a room with the actual facts between them, and that was enough for now. He went up to dinner. Thursday was quiet in the way that days before significant events are often quiet, the calm having the particular quality of something that is not natural but has been produced by everything available energy going into preparation rather than expression. The student body of Hogwarts had by now processed the article through the full cycle of school rumor and counter-rumor and settled into a general understanding that something significant was happening to and around Harry Potter, that it involved magic done to him without his knowledge, and that the specifics were documented and real rather than invented. The response to this varied by house and by individual in the way that responses to uncomfortable truths always varied, some people processing through anger on his behalf, some through the uncomfortable recalibration of realizing that the version of Harry Potter they'd believed in was partly constructed, some through the slightly guilty recognition that they'd at various points called him a liar or a glory seeker and were now sitting with what that said about them. Malfoy was navigating the most complicated personal recalibration. Harry watched him across the Great Hall at dinner on Thursday and thought about what it must feel like to have spent 5 years measuring yourself against someone and then discover that the version you were measuring yourself against was running at 35%. Not with satisfaction, he couldn't make himself feel satisfied about that, it was just a fact that carried its own complicated weight. Neville sat down next to Harry at dinner and said, without preamble, "I want to work with you." Harry looked at him. Neville had changed in the past 2 weeks in the way that people change when the thing they've been adjusting themselves to accommodate is removed. The dynamic of the DA, of Harry teaching, had shifted when Harry's capacity started restoring, and Neville, who had always been one of the DA's most genuinely committed members, had apparently felt that shift and decided something about it. "The DA," Harry said. "The DA. But not the way it was." Neville was looking at him with a directness that Neville hadn't always had but had been growing into across 5 years of persistent, unglamorous courage. "The way it could be now. I've been practicing a lot, this year. I'm not the same as first year. And I think," he stopped. "I think Voldemort isn't going to wait for us to finish school, and I'd rather learn properly while there's still time to learn." Harry looked at him. He thought about Neville, about the boy who'd arrived on the Hogwarts Express unable to get on his broom, who'd been told by the Wizarding World's assessment systems that he had marginal talent, who had nonetheless turned up at the Ministry of Magic in 5th year and fought. The boy whose parents were in St. Mungo's, whose grandmother had spent 11 years managing the damage to a family broken by a war Neville had no part in starting. He thought about the suppressed capability complex, the binding that had targeted Harry's perception of his own skill relative to others. He wondered, not for the first time this week, whether the ministry's and Hogwarts's and society's tendency to sort people by apparent capability at 11 or 12 or 15 had produced other misreadings. Other compressed people living in rooms they thought were the world. "Yeah," he said. "Come to the room of requirement Saturday morning." Neville nodded, once, with the specific satisfaction of someone who has asked for something they needed and been told yes without negotiation. "Bring Luna," Harry said. Neville blinked. "Luna? Tell her I'd like her there." Harry returned to his food. Neville returned to his. The great hall moved around them with the ordinary noise of people living the lives they were living, and the fire burned, and the enchanted ceiling showed a clear June night already collecting its first stars, and somewhere below the ordinary noise was the gathering quality of things about to change, the low frequency of history deciding on a direction. The morning of the hearing Harry woke at 5 again. He was beginning to think this was simply his natural rhythm without the suppression, his mind apparently a 5 in the morning mind, and lay in the quiet of his dormitory with the specific quality of attention that had become his default resting state. He thought about what today would look like. He thought about the Wisengamot chamber, high and circular, tiered seating, the bench of officials at the front where Fudge would be sitting with whatever remained of his authority. He thought about Marchbanks. He thought about the named parties, Dumbledore's name in the record, Snape's, the flagged Moody Horcrux signature, the unidentified fourth caster who Aldrich hadn't been able to place and who Harry had his own quiet theory about that he hadn't yet shared with anyone. He thought about Voldemort, who was out there making calculations about a version of Harry Potter that was no longer accurate, and whose revised calculations after Sunday's Hogsmeade engagement were probably producing results that the old plan couldn't accommodate. He thought about what it meant to win, not as a concept, not as the abstract destination of a chosen one narrative, but as a practical question: what did winning this specific conflict actually require? He'd had 10 days of running his full cognitive capacity, increasingly, and the picture he'd built was clearer than anything he'd ever produced before, and it said something that the suppressed version of him had never been able to see. Voldemort's power was not primarily magical. It was structural. It was the architecture of fear, the way he built a network of obligation and threat and ideological investment that made fighting him cost more than accepting him, for enough people, that the scale tipped in his favor. The magic was real and significant, but it was the enforcement mechanism, not the foundation. Knock out the foundation and the enforcement mechanism, however powerful, had nothing to sustain it. The foundation was information management. The belief that Voldemort was inevitable, that resistance was futile, that the people with power were aligned with him or at least wouldn't oppose him. The ministry's complicity, even passive complicity, the refusal to confirm his return, the muzzling of Harry last year, had been load-bearing for that structure. Friday's hearing didn't end the war. But it knocked out a piece of the foundation. He got dressed, went downstairs to the empty common room, and sat by the dead fire in the grey pre-dawn and thought about his parents. The grief complex had been restoring gradually, the way Aldrich said it would, not a flood but a steady returning, fragments and associations and feelings coming back through cleared channels at a pace his system could handle. He'd been getting more about them every day. Not memories exactly, he'd been too young for stored memories, but the emotional archaeology of them, the shapes of people he'd lost so early that what remained was more sensation than picture. Sirius had been talking to him every night through the fire. Not about strategy, not about the hearing, not about any of it. About James and Lily. About who they were, the full versions, the people rather than the legends. The way James laughed too loudly and never cared. The way Lily could make a room feel safer without doing anything specific that you could point to. The way they'd loved each other with the slightly competitive devotion of two people who were always interested in what the other thought, who found each other genuinely interesting beyond the relationship itself. The way they'd both, in their different ways, been exactly the kind of person who wouldn't have wanted their son made smaller to survive. Harry sat with that by the dead fire. He thought about being 14 months old, and someone standing over him with architectural intention, and tried to find, not the rage, which was there and real and had its place, but the human sense of it. Dumbledore standing over a baby who just lost his parents and deciding that the kindest thing was to make sure the baby couldn't feel the full weight of that loss. The grief complex from when he was 2. The sorrow in Dumbledore's face when he'd explained it. He thought about what it meant to love someone so much in the wrong direction that the love became a cage. He didn't forgive it. He wasn't there yet, and he wasn't going to perform being there. But he could hold both things, the wrong and the grief behind the wrong, without needing to resolve them into a single feeling. He was getting better at holding complexity. At 6:30, Ron came downstairs in his pajamas, looked at Harry sitting by the fire, said, "Thought so," and went to the kitchen portrait to request breakfast brought up. They ate toast by the unlit fire in the early morning quiet, the two of them, and talked about nothing in particular, about the upcoming Quidditch season, about Fred and George's shop, about whether Crookshanks's extended absence from the dormitory was concerning or whether the castle was simply to his taste, and it was the most ordinary thing in the world and it was exactly what Harry needed. The ordinary world held in both hands, the weight of it real and good. Hermione came down at 7 with her brief, already annotated and cross-referenced, and they went to the ministry. The Wizengamot chamber was exactly as Harry had imagined it. High and circular and old, stone and dark wood, the tiered seating arranged in the way of a space designed to make the person at its center feel observed from every angle simultaneously, which was either intimidating or irrelevant depending on how you felt about being observed. Harry walked in with Aldrich on one side and McGonagall on the other, and behind them Pomfrey and Hermione carrying the documentary backup, and he walked to the center of the chamber and stood there while 200 witches and wizards in purple robes looked at him. He looked back. Fudge was at the bench. He had the controlled composure of a man who has prepared for this and is ready to execute, and under the composure was something tighter, a man who knows his position is precarious and is running the management of it with the focused desperation of someone bailing a boat. Dumbledore was there. He'd come, which Harry had expected. The man's sense of personal accountability, whatever else, would not allow him to send a representative. He was seated in the witnesses section, not at the officials' bench, which said something about how this had been structured. He looked at Harry when Harry came in and Harry met his eyes briefly and then looked at the bench. Marchbanks was center. Wizengamot special session, she said, in the tone of someone who has run 10,000 of these and is going to run this one the same way she runs all of them, which is efficiently and without deference to personal discomfort, called under the Independent Evidence Statute, Case Reference 1996 ME 04. The matter before this body is the documentary clinical record submitted by healer Tomas Aldrich regarding the magical status of Harry James Potter, minor, and the statutory implications thereof. She looked at Harry. "Mr. Potter. You are the subject of the record and you are here as a primary witness. You'll answer questions put to you by members of this body. Do you understand?" "Yes," Harry said. "Good." She looked at her notes. "The record has been reviewed in advance by the full panel. The clinical findings are not in dispute, the methodology has been examined by the Department of Magical Health and confirmed as standard diagnostic practice. What this body is here to determine is the statutory implication of those findings and the appropriate procedural response." She looked up. "We'll begin with the clinical summary. Healer Aldrich." Aldrich stood. He delivered the clinical summary in the same dry, precise mode he'd used in the hospital wing 10 days ago, except distilled for a non-clinical audience into its most relevant elements, the 40 constructs, the categories, the timeline, the caster signatures. He spoke for 12 minutes. The chamber was absolutely silent for all 12 of them. When he finished, the silence lasted a moment longer than silence usually did. Then it broke into the particular noise of a large room of people who have received information they must now process, and Marchbanks let it run for about 10 seconds before calling order. The questioning began. Most of it was directed at Aldrich, technical questions about methodology, about the identification of caster signatures, about the legal framework for the statutory violations. Harry watched the panel work and read the room with the full pattern recognition capacity he now had, tracking alliances and positions and the particular quality of attention that indicated someone was preparing a specific line of argument. Fudge's faction was working on credibility. 3 members asked, in varying formulations, whether the diagnostic methodology was universally accepted and whether there were other interpretations of the caster signature readings. Aldrich handled these with the calm precision of a man who knows the ground he's standing on and is not moved by questions designed to suggest the ground might be unstable. Marchbanks handled the rest with the efficiency of someone who has seen every procedural delay tactic invented in the last 100 years and is personally unimpressed by all of them. When they got to Harry, the questions were direct. "Mr. Potter," said a senior Wisengamot member whose name Harry recognized from the trial last year, "Madam Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, a woman of the Marchbanks School of Directness, can you describe, in your own words, what you have experienced since the removal process began?" Harry described it. He was concise, not because he was managing the information but because he'd had the experience and organized its description in his own mind and didn't need to perform either more or less than it was. He described the fog. The gray quality of things. The scrambled eggs. The crack in the glass when the first binding was removed and what came through it, and what each subsequent removal added, and what it felt like at the end of 10 days to be the full version of himself rather than the constructed partial version. He spoke for about 8 minutes. The chamber was quiet in a different way than it had been quiet for Aldrich. It was quiet in the way of people who are listening to something true and recognizing it. In the 48 hours following the final removal, Bones said, "You responded to a Death Eater attack in Hogsmeade. There are 5 Aura-processed witness statements in the supplementary record describing your actions during that response." She looked at her notes. The Aura in charge noted, and I'm quoting, "Subject displayed magical capacity and tactical assessment significantly in excess of what would be expected for a student of his year and age." How do you respond to that characterization? "I think it's accurate," Harry said. "I also think it's a characterization that would have been accurate 5 years ago, and 3 years ago, and last year, if the capacity had been available to me. I'm not suddenly more capable than I was. I'm capable in the way I always would have been, if the constructs hadn't been in place." You're suggesting that your magical development for the past 5 years has been artificially constrained. Healer Aldrich's clinical record demonstrates that. I'm confirming the experiential reality of what the clinical record documents. Bones looked at him for a moment. "Thank you, Mr. Potter." Fudge leaned forward. He had the contained desperation of a man making a calculated last move. "Mr. Potter," he said, with the warmth of a man performing care he doesn't currently have capacity to actually feel, "this body has nothing but the utmost, Minister," Marchbanks said. "Yes. Your questions will go through the standard process." She looked at her notes. "You have the floor in sequence." Fudge's warmth flickered. "Of course," he said. When his turn came, he asked 2 questions that were both aimed at the same thing, establishing that Harry might have a personal interest in an outcome that reflected negatively on certain parties, and that therefore his testimony, while sympathetic, should be weighed against the possibility of not lying exactly. Fudge was too experienced to say lying, emotionally influenced recollection. Harry let him finish. "The clinical record," Harry said, "is Healer Aldrich's work, not mine. The caster signature analysis is instrument-based, not testimony-based. The statutory violations are defined by the constructs themselves, not by anything I've said about how they affected me." He looked at Fudge with the clear, uninfected attention he'd developed for looking at people who were operating on the assumption that he was still the manageable version of himself. "My emotional state doesn't change what the instruments read. It doesn't change who placed what and when. The record is the record." Fudge looked at him. For a moment, a brief moment that Harry logged and filed away, something moved behind Fudge's eyes that was more honest than anything else he'd shown in the chamber. Not guilt exactly. The thing that precedes guilt in a person not quite ready to feel it, the recognition that they have been found out, fully and formally and in a setting that can't be managed into a different shape. "Thank you, Mr. Potter," Fudge said, and leaned back. Marchbanks looked at the panel. "We'll take a 30-minute recess before deliberation." Harry stood outside in the corridor with Ron and Hermione and didn't talk much. Ron had his arms crossed and was leaning against the wall with the satisfied expression of someone who has watched something go exactly the way it should go and is giving the satisfaction the quiet it deserves. Hermione was going through her notes with the post-event energy of someone who has been running at high capacity and needs to discharge it into review. Dumbledore appeared in the corridor 20 minutes into the recess. He moved toward Harry with the particular quality of someone who has decided to do something and is not going to be managed out of doing it, and Harry thought, with the new clarity that was now simply his baseline, that this was probably the most genuinely himself Dumbledore had been around him in 5 years. The managed warmth was gone. What was left was an old man with a complicated history and an honest understanding of what he'd done. "Harry," he said. "I want to say something before whatever the outcome is." "Go ahead," Harry said. Ron and Hermione, without a word exchanged, moved about 10 feet down the corridor. Present but not adjacent. Harry filed that too, the specific grace of people who knew when to give space without being asked. "The identity anchors," Dumbledore said. "Not the suppressants or the cognitive filters, those I can construct an argument for, wrong as I believe that argument now to be. The identity anchors." He looked at Harry with the unguarded quality he'd shown in the hospital wing but more complete now, as if the hearing had removed the last available layer of self-protection. "Those were not protective. They were, I told myself they were. I constructed a logic for them in which the world was safer if you believed yourself smaller. But the truth," he stopped. "The truth is that they were the choice of a man who needed you to be manageable. Not for the war. For his own, for the particular comfort of someone who has been managing the world's large things for a very long time and has confused management with wisdom." Harry looked at him. "I was afraid of you," Dumbledore said. "Not of what you would do. I never believed you would become dangerous in the way the Dark Lord feared. I was afraid of what I would lose if you were fully yourself. The role I'd cast myself in, as your guardian, your guide, the architect of the plan that would save everything. That role required a version of you who needed the guidance. A fully capable Harry Potter didn't need me in the same way. And I chose, without ever being honest with myself about the choice, to prefer the version who did." The corridor was very quiet. "I know," Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. "I worked it out," Harry said. "Last week. The logic of it. Why the identity anchors specifically." He paused. "I wanted to hear you say it." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "And now that I have." Harry considered this with the full honesty the question deserved. "I think," he said slowly, "that you've done genuine, significant harm, and that you've also done genuine, significant good, and that I'm going to spend a long time working out how to hold both of those simultaneously. I think that today's process is necessary regardless of what I feel about you personally, because it isn't only about me, it's about whether this kind of thing can be done to someone without consequence, and the answer needs to be no, formally and on record." He looked at the old man. "And I think that when this is over, and when I've had time to process what was done and let the memories finish restoring, I might be willing to have the rest of that conversation you offered me. The one without management." Dumbledore held his gaze. Something moved in his face that was too genuine to be dignity and too dignified to be simple emotion. "I'll be there," he said. "Whenever you're ready." They walked back into the chamber separately. The deliberation took 40 minutes. Marchbanks delivered the findings in the measured, precise tone of someone reading a legal document that she has had a hand in shaping and is satisfied with. The Wisingamot found, unanimously, that the constructs documented in Healer Aldrich's clinical record constituted statutory violations under Magical Welfare Act 1847, C and its amendments. They found that the placing of said constructs on a minor without consent or court-authorized guardianship approval was a Category 1 magical offense. They found that the documented casters, identified in the sealed record as Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore and Severus Tobias Snape, with a third signature under continued investigation, were to be formally charged and subject to hearing within 30 days. On the question of immediate punitive action, the body found that the specific circumstances, the active wartime conditions, the ongoing magical conflict with Lord Voldemort, and the demonstrated value of both individuals' roles in that conflict, warranted suspension of immediate custodial response pending the formal hearing. They were not cleared. They were not charged and dismissed. They were charged and held in a state of legal accountability that would be resolved when the full hearing could address it properly. Fudge received a formal censure, not a charge, but a censure on record, for his office's attempt to interfere with the disclosure and processing of the clinical findings. It was not what Harry might have wanted for him, and it was not nothing. Harry listened to all of it without expression. When Marchbanks finished, she looked at Harry directly, across the chamber, over the 197 witches and wizards in purple robes between them. "Mr. Potter," she said. "The record is entered. The charges are laid. The process will run its course." She paused. "Is there anything you wish to say before this session closes?" Harry thought about it. He thought about the fog. The grey quality of scrambled eggs on a Tuesday morning. The crack in the glass when the first removal hit. 39 more cracks after that, and what came through each one: color, clarity, emotion, himself, arriving in pieces over 10 days until the last anchor was cut and he was simply here, the full size of himself in the full light of a morning that tasted like what it was. He thought about Sirius's voice through the fire, telling him about James. He thought about Ron eating cold hot chocolate by the dead fire. He thought about Hermione's notebook, dense with documentation, and Neville in the Great Hall asking to learn properly, and Madame Pomfrey positioning herself at his right as if her physical presence was a statement. He thought about Lily Potter, who he didn't have memories of but whose emotional shape was returning daily through the cleared channels, arriving as sensation rather than image, warmth and sharpness and a quality of love that was simultaneously absolute and completely uncondescending, love that didn't require smallness from its object. He stood up. "No," he said. "The record says it." Marchbanks nodded once. "Session closed," she said. He came out of the ministry into the afternoon. The day was brilliant, June in London, sun at full height, the street outside the ministry phone box full of the ordinary world moving at its ordinary speed. Buses and pigeons and people who had no idea that in a chamber 50 feet underground something had just shifted, formally and on record, in the shape of a conflict that had been running since before he was born. Ron and Hermione came out behind him. Hermione was doing something to her face that in another person would have been crying, and in Hermione was the absolute maximum of her permitted emotional display, which meant her eyes were bright and her mouth was pressed together very firmly and she was looking at the middle distance with great determination. Ron put his arm around her shoulders and then looked at Harry and said, "Pub?" Harry looked at him. "We're 15, he said. "Butterbeer at the Leaky Cauldron," Ron said. "Obviously." "Obviously," Harry agreed. They walked down the street in the afternoon sun, the three of them, close in the way they'd been close since a troll in a bathroom in first year had settled the question of whether they were friends, and the world was complicated and unresolved and had a war in it and would require a great deal more from all of them before anything like an ending, but right now it was also June, and sunny, and they were walking, and Harry was all of himself. Not the constructed version. Not the managed version. Not the boy who was made small so that someone else's plan had room to work. Himself. He thought about Voldemort, out there somewhere recalculating, building a new picture of an opponent who was no longer what the old picture said. He thought about the 40 bindings and what they'd been doing to him and what their absence was now allowing, the full reservoir of what he was running at natural capacity, and he thought about the war and what it needed from him and felt, not fear, not the careful managed non-feeling of the suppressed years, but readiness. The clean, unambiguous readiness of someone who has been waiting their entire life to do what they were built for and is now, finally, built for it. He'd needed the 10 days. The healing, the accounting, the hearing. He'd needed to do it in order, the bindings first, the truth second, the record third. But it was done now. The foundation was changed. The structure of the conflict had a new shape, and whatever Voldemort was planning from his recalculated position, he was planning against a Harry Potter who was no longer the thing the 40 bindings had made him. He was planning against the real one. Harry thought about that and felt something that was quiet and certain and warm in the way of things that are simply true. The butterbeer at the Leaky Cauldron was cold and sweet, and Tom the barman looked at the three of them over the bar with the slightly startled expression of a man trying to work out why one of his regulars looked different, looked bigger somehow, looked more, and couldn't locate the specific change but felt it clearly. Harry drank his butterbeer and listened to Ron argue with Hermione about whether the Chudley Cannons had any realistic prospects for the upcoming season, which they didn't, and which Ron's loyalty required him to dispute anyway, and laughed at something Ron said with the full unguarded sound of a laugh that didn't have a dampener on it. The sound surprised him slightly. It came out richer than he expected. More present. Entirely his. He thought, there it is. He thought, that's what I sound like. He listened to it fade into the pub noise around him, the ordinary warm noise of a world that was worth fighting for, complicated and flawed and full of people doing their best and sometimes getting it very wrong and sometimes getting it exactly right, and he let it sit there, that simple fact of himself laughing in a pub on a June afternoon, the most ordinary thing in the world. He was going to need to contact Sirius tonight. He was going to need to think hard about the DA's new structure and what he could teach now that he had everything available. He was going to need to keep working with Aldrich through the memory restoration and stay honest about what came up. He was going to need to figure out what he wanted the conversation with Dumbledore to look like when he was ready for it. He was going to need to finish the war. But right now he was in the Leaky Cauldron on a Tuesday in June, and the butterbeer was cold and his friends were arguing about Quidditch, and he was entirely himself. He finished his drink. He was ready.